Yo, Atlas speaking, and welcome to part 8 of What If an Evil Assassin Reincarnated in Naruto as a Human-Tailed Beast. Let the tale begin. Chapter 170, The Finals, Effect and Game Plan. POV narration. A few more days passed before the finals of the Chunin exams started for good. The arena was just the same, but tensions were quite high. The first fight was not quite as difficult to predict in the eyes of the people, however. The number 1 and 2 in the Dark Brotherhood had to stand off against each other. It was clear that the one ranked higher would win, right? But where the question truly stood was whether or not Uzumaki Tatsuko really had it in him to defeat either one of them. He struggled so much just with number 7, right? How exactly is he going to beat 2 or 1? I hear he defeated 4 or 5 or something during the preliminaries. Maybe it was just a bad matchup? Who knows? Not like we've seen that match. Maybe he struggled even more back then? The atmosphere was bustling once more, and speculations rose from all of the guests and viewers. Every word, every jeer, every mocking insult or belittling phrase. All of them were like a small weight, all added one on top of another, all falling onto Tatsuko's head, who stood off to the side and listened to everything. The public had somewhat lost their trust in his abilities due to his previous performance, but he knew he had a chance to redeem himself. Still, the fact that he had gotten pushed to that point by someone much younger than him was just plain demoralizing. His only real ray of hope was the fact that his teacher, the Raikage, still trusted wholeheartedly that he'd win. Still, his morale had gone down drastically, and the haughty attitude he carried around the arena had all but vanished, so Ume's efforts hadn't been for naught. Well, they would have meant something regardless, as she had done a great job of representing the Brotherhood on the stage. She had made both her father and siblings proud. But now that Tatsuko was actually affected by the difficulty of his fight with Ume, Ken felt more content with the situation, as knocking the genius down a few pegs had been the plan all along. Moving on from that, I wonder how this match is going to go. Ken's senses scanned over the arena, where the two opponents were already standing, facing each other with quite a bit of distance in between them. They were both dressed similarly, the only difference being that Morita carried 2 blades on his back, whilst Tatsuko carried only one on his belt. They were both hidden underneath their clothes regardless, but Ken was well aware of their fighting styles. In a battle between the two of them, Ken already knew who was most likely to win, but not in that exact sterile environment. At the end of the day, the assassins of the Brotherhood were trained to fight in all kinds of terrains, but they all excelled in places where they could hide, misguide, and ambush their opponents, essentially turning fights into assassinations. Tatsuko was certainly the faster of the two, his skill set better suited for confrontations like these, but Morita was also well accustomed to his speed, and he had a larger repertoire of techniques, gained through a lot of hard work. Whilst one spent time creating and polishing a technique to perfection, the flash step of Tatsuko, the other spent that time enlarging their repertoire of jutsu and techniques. As Tatsuko was gaining experience and mastery over a customized fighting style based on his created technique, Morita was gaining mastery over the jutsu he had learned, and adapting his own fighting style. The two were technically still a bit far off skill-wise, with Tatsuko firmly outclassing all his siblings. It went to the point where Ken pondered on making him a blade officially. But Morita still had the chance to surprise everyone if he cooked up a good enough strategy to counter his opponent's fighting style. In essence, Ken really hoped to see something impressive. Well, not see. Witness would be a more accurate word to use. First fight of the finals. Number 1 of the Dark Brotherhood fighting against number 2. Begin! The referee's voice sounded out, and the entire arena became silent in an instant, transfixed on the two competitors. No words were spoken, but one thing was clear. Neither was going to be going easy on the other. In an instant, Tatsuko shot forward like a bullet, surprising the audience once more with his impressive speed and forward momentum as he tried to deliver a spinning kick to his opponent's masked face. Morita was already expecting that, however. Without any hesitation he landed backwards, the kick slipping above him in the same move. He rolled to the side, as Tatsuko used Flash Step to crush the ground where Morita had been previously, his one leg stuck into the ground with enough force to put fear in the hearts of some of the audience. Damn. So that's why they call him the One-Leg Devil. Some of the audience members had already heard of Tatsuko and his reputation. Yep, no matter how many times I see him, his fighting style is just as incomprehensibly fast-paced. It seemed that the reputation coupled with his previous performance had garnered him quite a few fans among the audience. But that number 2 guy isn't bad either. Seems like he can follow the movements clearly enough. Morita's performances also didn't leave much to be desired, as he moved at impressive speeds as well, managing to react in time at the very least. Back on the already cracked ground of the arena, Tatsuko had already dashed towards Morita once more, this time circling around all over the arena at breakneck speeds, both in the air and on the ground, breaking the sound barrier at many points all around Morita. The number 2 assassin seemed unfazed, his mask cleanly hiding whatever expression he had as intended. He simply stood still and slowly unsheathed his blades, pointing them towards the ground before doing something surprising. The second another boom was heard, Morita threw one of his blades at an odd angle, straight at Tatsuko, who was dashing towards him. 2 more booms were heard, as the number 1 assassin dashed to the side and further away from his opponent, looking a bit confused. That's odd. Why didn't you try to attack me? Morita muttered as his hand still gripped the one blade he had on hand. I'm not in a habit of getting injured. Tatsuko smiled underneath his mask as he slowly stretched the muscles in his body. There was only one exploitable weakness in Tatsuko's technique. And that was the fact that it was too fast, which led to it moving in straight lines. It was also damn near impossible for the user to control it unless they had absolute concentration. That one weakness was what made the technique a bit predictable, at least to someone who knew it and had fought against it before. Anyone else would have just been overwhelmed by the speed and odd angles of attack. In this case, however, since Morita already knew the trajectory of the attack and had his blade ready, it would have been dangerous to continue on that same trajectory or any nearby angle. Of course, this weakness could only be exploited because Morita himself was no slouch, being as fast as a top-level jonin in reaction time. Morita's next move was also something to be expected. Water release, bubbles technique. The number 2's free hand moved quickly and formed a few quick handsings before he brought a finger to his mouth and blew out. Bubbles? Yep, around 100 small bubbles rushed out of the assassin's mouth. They immediately filled the air around him, forming something like a cloud around him. Some were close to the ground, but they never did touch it. Instead, they seemed to be controlled by the user, who made them hover in the air around him. I've spent a long time thinking about ways to counter your technique. This is the best I could come up with. Morita sighed as he looked at the bubbles surrounding him with a smile. Soap bubble ninjutsu was a branch of ninjutsu from the water release nature transformation. And normally one would need a special tool to release the bubbles. But Morita had already prepared for that, requesting modifications to his mask, allowing it to act as that tool. Tatsuko's smile couldn't help but become wider as he also eyed those bubbles. He immediately tested one of the bubbles, sending a kunai towards it in an instant. The moment the metallic tip of that small kunai made contact with the bubble, it burst, and a small explosion was released, breaking the kunai apart and sending pieces of it flying back at Tatsuko, who simply hopped to the side to avoid them. Interesting. The one-legged devil muttered before immediately starting to circle Morita using his flash step, likely looking for any blind spots or openings. Eventually, he spotted one, but he stopped himself before rushing in. There's no way he would fail to defend himself from that angle. He's just baiting me into a death trap. Both number 1 and 2 were experienced, and they knew each other's fighting styles and way of thinking well enough. So the situation turned into a momentary stalemate. Ken, from the top of the arena, couldn't help but smile underneath his mask. Let's see how this plays out. Chapter 171, Barrage, Blockage in Winter. Ken and the leaders of the Alliance weren't the only ones closely observing the situation from afar. Takehiko, the Uzumaki prodigy, was also looking at the fight and taking mental notes of everything, including the weaknesses of Tatsuko's techniques. The only real problem was that taking advantage of the one-legged devil's technique took a certain amount of skill. A skill that one could gain only by fighting against said technique. I can't possibly know all of number 1's tendencies and attack patterns from one battle. Especially when number 2 seems to be suppressing his fighting style so effectively. Regardless, in Takehiko's eyes, Morita was shaping up to be an even more annoying opponent than Tatsuko. At least the one-legged devil was easier to face in a straightforward battle. His attack patterns could still be studied, even if broadly. The adamantite ceiling chains could defend him from quite a few angles as well. But Morita's fighting style was a lot harder to discern, as it seemed to change a lot depending on the opponent. He may already have a way to go against the ceiling chains. At the very least, he's likely to have paid attention to my previous matches enough to build up some type of strategy or plan. Of course, that applied to both number 1 and 2, but at least Takehiko had some inkling as to how Tatsuko would fight him. Morita seemed to be much closer to your usual shinobi, with so many tricks up his sleeve that it was hard to tell what he'd pull next. Even the bubble release was somewhat unexpected. I don't even know what chakra natures he has, and how many transformations he's mastered. But it can't be more than one, right? Even the most talented Chunin didn't have more than one nature transformation. Mastering an element to the point of being able to use a derivative technique of it was rare, especially so for someone in their age group. Hell, Takehiko himself only knew some basic jutsu, but he had some powerful ones in his arsenal too, thanks to being a favored pupil of the Uzukage. But he was not yet a master in his chakra nature, which was also water. I guess I'll have to find a way to defeat either of them. At this stage it's hard to tell who'd win. Back within the confines of the arena, Morita and Tatsuko seemed to be stuck in a stare-down. At first, the one-legged devil thought about using projectiles to pop all of the bubbles. He'd just make more. But I guess that would be a way of draining his chakra a bit until he decides to go on the offensive, which he may do regardless. In an instant, the number 1 assassin's instincts blared at him, and he immediately dashed to the side, just as a gigantic earth dragon rose from his previous position. Earth release, stone dragon bullets. Takehiko remained moving, dashing from one part of the arena to another as more and more dragons rose from wherever his feet touched the ground and continued to follow his trail. But the dirt dragons moved slow, too slow to ever catch someone like Tatsuko. The one-legged devil was dancing circles around them, able to easily even make them smash against one another and cancel them out. Normally, the jutsu Morita used would make the dragons rise from the user's feet or an area near them. But it seemed that the number 2 assassin was somehow able to bypass that. No, rather, he's making the dragons travel through the ground and rise out right underneath his opponent. Ken could easily feel the subtle vibrations within the ground. Morita had likely coated the dragons in water to make them travel more easily through the fragmented arena. Tatsuko sweated a bit as he dashed around, eventually reaching a position in midair where around 10 dragons were all headed directly for his body, virtually from every angle, likely exactly what Morita had planned. In an instant, the number 1 assassin finished a basic jutsu with one-hand sign. Wind release, breakthrough. It was a weaker version of the Great Breakthrough, but the fact that it was performed with one-hand sign was still impressive. It showcased a certain level of mastery, one that once again impressed Takehiko greatly. Still, would such a jutsu be enough to break down a dragon? Normally no. But at this moment, Morita had split up his chakra quite a bit, leading to the overall technique becoming quite a bit weaker. The gouts of wind that Tatsuko spat out seemed to harm one of the dragons, cracking him slightly but not breaking him instantly. The current also pushed the number 1 assassin backwards slightly, which was what the one-legged devil was actually aiming for. With an unnatural burst of speed, the assassin twirled around and passed in between 2 of the dragons that had been closing in on him, dashing forward with a smile on his face. What he didn't expect, unfortunately, was for the area in front of him to be completely blanketed by water bubbles, which had moved in whilst he was facing the other stone dragons. He didn't have the time to rearrange his course before hitting 3 different bubbles head-on. He only really had time to raise one of his hands to defend his face/mask. The bubbles exploded immediately, and Tatsuko was blown backwards just as the stone dragons all collided together, creating another explosion of rocks that threatened to skewer the one-legged devil. And for a moment, they seemed to be successful. Rocks broke into the number 1 assassin's back and dust rose to cover the entire area. Holy shit! The Raikage muttered, not quite expecting a fight between youngsters to be that engaging. The previous two had been against Jinchuriki, and whilst they were impressive they hadn't quite gone to that level of planning and skill, as both Jinchuriki were quite inexperienced. Instead of a fight between Chunin, this feels more like a fight between top Jonin contenders. The white fan of Konoha also couldn't help but express his shock. He gave Ken a look filled with respect as he spoke. To think he could foster and grow such talents under him. Not one of the performances of the Dark Brotherhood has been underwhelming. The fight isn't over yet, however. The Hokage also spoke out, huffing another smoke of his tobacco pipe. He really is addicted to it, isn't he? Welp, at least he isn't smiling opium, yet. As Ken thought that, the smoke in the arena had finally cleared, revealing a rather strange sight. Instead of a broken and severely injured Tatsuko, it was him, being mostly intact aside from his cloak being completely shredded and his back having a few bruises. Only Ken really knew how Tatsuko had managed to achieve that. And it had a lot to do with a certain seal currently on the number 1 young assassin's neck. A tweaked version of a chakra-gathering seal. Instead of giving the user an accessible emergency pool of chakra usable for one jutsu, it gathers enough nature energy for an emergency transformation of a few seconds. It was something that Tatsuko himself had devised, with some minor pointers from Ken and their resident Fuinjutsu teacher, Uzumaki Kazue. The seal itself was nothing too complex, but it was a lot more dangerous to use than the regular chakra-gathering seal. It provided an instant boost in nature energy. If one used it whilst not having enough chakra in their body, they would just as instantly turn to stone. In this case, the chakra and nature energy within Tatsuko's body were not balanced, and he grew scales much like his father would, shielding him from harm. By the time the sum dissipated, the scales had also vanished, as the nature energy from the seal was fleeting, a flaw that Tatsuko hadn't quite managed to iron out yet. Tatsuko immediately dashed towards Morita, who seemed quite winded from all of the jutsu he had used. He was surely running out of chakra at that point, or was at least closer to his limits than he'd want to admit. They were all prohibited from using the chakra of their siblings during the competition. It was a move made to keep things somewhat fair at least, so Morita's natural reserves were all he had. That and a few regular chakra-gathering seals, but only 3 could go on the human body before it messed with one's regular chakra network. Morita still had some bubbles left, quite a few of them in fact, but they were quickly dispatched by a few dozen throwing knives, shuriken, and kunai from Tatsuko. Rather, the explosions being in close proximity to Morita only helped make things worse. Thankfully he came out rather unharmed, if a bit wet. Immediately, the number 2 assassin tried preparing one last jutsu, aiming to stop Tatsuko in his tracks for good this time whilst pushing the few bubbles he had left towards him. What he didn't expect was for Tatsuko to stop right before reaching him and the bubbles, with his hands planted on the ground. Lightning release, spider net shock. It was at that point that the winded Morita knew things were pretty much over. The shock from the ground was nowhere near enough to knock him out, but it was enough to momentarily paralyze his muscles for a second or two. And a second was a lot of time for someone like Tatsuko, who dashed towards him like a bloodhound smelling fresh meat. He easily sidestepped a few bubbles and reached Morita's side, with his tanto already resting on his opponent's neck. And just like that, the fight was over. Winner, number 1 of the Dark Brotherhood. The announcer wasted no time doing his job either, and the crowd immediately broke into claps and cheers. Takiko also smiled. I may not know how he withstood that attack, but at least I'll still have a better chance to win while fighting him. The next fight will be the last, determining the winner of the Chunin exams. Ken smiled underneath his mask, somewhat anticipating the fight. Not quite the last one. We old-timers still have to put on a show. Miffy muttered, rolling his shoulder as he did so. Heh, of course. Don't forget that you have to fight me, Ken. The Raikage smiled, a lot more excited about the prospect. We can always do a free-for-all dash. Yorihiko muttered as he looked at the Hokage and nodded. Bah! You two would just gang up on me. The Raikage immediately shot the idea down, eyeing the two old allies with a cheeky smile on his face. Whatever, regardless of how things develop, they are bound to be entertaining. The Hokage also gave everyone a calm smile, smoke coming out of his mouth as he spoke. Indeed. Let's see just how much Takehiko can back up his arrogance. Chapter 172, Comfort, Announcement and Final Battle. Morita sighed as he walked into the dark tunnel leading out of the arena. In a sense, he was now in a similar position to you and me, who he had quite literally just helped comfort a while back. But there was no gathering of siblings to comfort him for his loss. And he didn't take it quite as hard as you and me did. In a sense, he and Tatsuko had already fought numerous times. He only really won 1 out of 10 times. It was not pleasant, but the number 2 young assassin had to admit that he was somewhat outmatched. I still have so much room for improvement. He clenched his fists, his nails slightly digging into his plans as he continued to walk. I wouldn't recommend doing that. It's not like you have our father's regenerative abilities. A voice sounded out from behind him, making him turn his head slightly with a sigh. Come to gloat a bit, Tatsuko? The one that had come after him was none other than the very source of his current inner turmoil. Tatsuko simply hopped over to him, shaking his head slightly and sighing. He didn't respond instantly. Instead, he used his speed to immediately reach Morita and put his hand around his shoulder, somewhat supporting his legless side on him. Now, let's not get things twisted here. There is no such thing as gloating and jeering among siblings. We may compete a lot, as it is in both of our natures, but you are my brother at the end of the day. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Morita blinked a few times when hearing that. His mouth opened for a bit, but he couldn't seem to muster a proper response, so his lips just trembled a bit underneath his mask. Now, let's not get too sappy. Father said we're old enough to drink. Let's go to the bar. He said he'd see us there. I still can't get behind his jokes much, but I guess that's just because I have some trouble getting around in general, hee. Morita felt a vein bulge on his forehead. For some reason, he felt as if his night was going to be filled with jokes of that nature. I hate you both. Despite saying that, he supported Tatsuko and walked alongside him towards the bar with a smile on his face. You know, I just realized, but aren't we older than father? Morita blinked a few times as he came to that realization. Well, yes. But are you going to say that to his face? Tatsuko laughed a bit, also finding it somewhat amusing that their younger father deemed them old enough to drink. No. I doubt anyone would dare to say that to his face. The number 2 assassin just shrugged his shoulders and let the matter go. It wasn't like age meant anything to the children of the Brotherhood at that point. After all, they were struggling to get used to the Brotherhood in their earlier years. Ken was out there in the world making a living for them and gaining allies, all the while being younger than the children he was taking care of. It was hard to fathom what type of past someone could have to reach such a stage so early in life. But that was a common consensus all over the world, not just their Brotherhood. Everyone who knew of Ken held him in high regard, both due to fear and sheer respect. His presence simply demanded either one of them. So, when they reached the tavern, and the usually rambunctious people inside were all in silence, their heads dropped to the ground and leaning towards the walls of the room, they weren't shocked. Instinctively, they were doing their best to stay away from their still masked father, who was sitting on a stool with a round of drinks ready for them. They weren't surprised. Good job today, both of you. This night's on me. Ken took his mask off and smiled at the two of them, raising his cold cup of sake to them. Tatsuko and Morita looked at each other for a moment, before they both broke into a smile. And the vibe lasted through the night. The tavern owner was more than happy to serve them, with the jovial mood even bleeding into the rest of the tavern as all of its usual suspects eventually calmed down. But the night wasn't that long, and eventually Tatsuko had to go and rest, as he was still up for his last battle the following day. Morita followed him as well, taking his leave, quite tipsy as he had gone a bit overboard with the drinks. Ken hadn't stopped him, despite being the responsible adult there. A hangover is also a life lesson. The legendary assassin nodded to himself before slowly standing up, shaking the tavern owner's hand and leaving a decent tip along with his bill. Tomorrow is certainly going to be interesting. But Tatsuko should be able to win. I trust his skill and judgment. Of course, Yorihiko would say the same about his pupil. I guess I'll just have to see it myself. Thankfully, the night passed quickly enough. And the arena had filled up much faster than the days prior this time. Everyone was rather excited to see the end of the Chunin exams after all. Final battle of the Chunin exams. Number 1 of the Dark Brotherhood will be facing off against Uzumaki Takehiko, a prodigy of the Land of Whirlpools. The words of the announcer rang around the walls of the arena, and the contestants were already there, staring one another down. Well, at least Takehiko assumed that it was a stare down. He couldn't see his opponent's eyes behind his mask. The bell didn't ring yet, however, and the Hokage slowly stood up and walked forward. That's odd. I thought he'd give a speech after a winner is decided. As we are faced with the final battle in this grandiose event, I just wish to take a moment to appreciate all of the contestants that have competed up to this point, both within this grand arena and the preliminaries before this. The investors in the stands all nodded at the Hokage's words. Regardless of who won, it was clear that all of the hidden villages in the Three Corners Alliance were bound to flourish in the future. The power of their youth was a factor certainly, but the abundance of talents alone was already impressive, especially from the Dark Brotherhood. But the Leaf, the Cloud, and the Uzumaki were all impressive nonetheless. The only thing that was missing was the Samurai, but it was easy to assume that their strongest recruits had likely gotten bad matchups. The strength of the Land of Iron was not something any of the people in the crowd could begin to doubt. It was steadfast and strong throughout history, unshaken even during the time of the Warring States. They didn't need to prove anything, especially not when compared to the hidden villages that had been formed much sooner in comparison. It was hard to comprehend how there hadn't even been a full 60 years since the Warring States period had ended and the era of the hidden villages had begun. But that was just due to how much their lands had developed. At this rate, I believe it is fair to assume that the next few decades will be filled with only prosperity for the Three-Corner Alliance. Every noble and investor in the crowd came to that same conclusion in one way or another. And that only solidified one thing in their mind. Not doing business with the Alliance will only lead to a net loss, even in the long term. As a show of good faith, and to show our younger generations what the top of the world looks like, we, the leaders of the Alliance, have decided to put on an exhibition match. The fight shall be between two old friends. The Red Dot of the Dark Brotherhood, and the Third Raikage. That revelation made many of the people within the arena stare at the Hokage in stunned silence. That was before the excitement crept in, and they all started clapping. It was a rare opportunity, getting to see just how powerful the top of the world was. It wasn't just a display for the investors either, as it was going to help ground the powerful young generation, to show them that there was more to the world than just what they had seen up to that point. The Hokage didn't bother mentioning that they had initially wanted to make a small tournament to determine the strongest among the 5 leaders of the Alliance. They had essentially planned out to have several exhibition matches at first, with all of them fighting. But they figured that publicly displaying such a thing would not be fruitful, and one fight was enough to get the point across. So, the two that were eager to fight were left to display the true strength of their alliance. And, in the Hokage's eyes, none were better than them. His powers would have been too destructive to use within Konoha properly. Yorihiko was a seal master, and his fighting style was more unassuming. And Mifune was a pure swordsman and respectable samurai, but still slightly inferior to Ken. The Raikage was the fastest among them, and arguably just as resilient as Ken, minus the regeneration. His lighting chakra mode was specifically made for tough battles, and the Raikage had mastered it perfectly. And Ken was, well, He was already shaping up to be someone on the level of Hashirama. His skills really needed no introduction to anyone in their world. Unless they lived under a heavy rock. With that short announcement, the Hokage nodded when sensing the reaction of the crowd before looking back down at Tatsuko and Takiko. For now, let the battle begin, and let us see who the winner of this Chunin exam will be. With a smile on his face, the Hokage tipped his hat and raised his hand, before bringing it down as a sign. At that same moment, the bell was heard, and Hiruzen's voice rang out as well. Battle start. Chapter 173, Talents, Swiftness, and Reward. The first one to make a move this time was Takiko, his hands moving like a blur as he stepped forward. Water style, water dragon bullets. Four gigantic water dragons arched from the Uzumaki prodigy's mouth, all heading towards Tatsuko, who just sighed. In an instant, he turned in a blur, sidestepping the dragons and rushing directly at Takiko, who seemed to be prepared for him. A loud metallic clang sounded out through the entire arena as the one-legged assassin's blade screeched against his opponents. With a heave and a smile, the Uzumaki gained the upper hand, pushing the assassin away and slashing at him in the same move. Tatsuko was not that easy to hit. Unfortunately, he didn't even use flash step. He just leaned backwards and allowed the blade to pass right above him whilst pointing the tip of his blade at Takiko's chest. The Uzumaki immediately jumped backwards, only his clothes being slightly nicked by the oddly positioned thrust of the assassin. As expected, he'll try to end the fight quickly and efficiently, a trend that assassination specialists would always follow. Takiko had done quite a bit of research in preparation for his fight. He somewhat realized that he wasn't that untouchable thanks to Uemi, the number 7 of the Brotherhood, almost beating him earlier. This time he also didn't start the fight using his bloodline limit, testing the waters a bit and choosing some different strategies. But Tatsuko's next move did blow most of his plans out of the water. The one-legged devil turned into a blur once again, but this time it somehow felt even faster than before. His figure flashed all over the arena in seconds, after images began to appear and disappear, leading to the Uzumaki to be unable even to predict where he'd attack from. His afterimages appeared everywhere, at all angles, both in midair and on the ground. Did he get faster? Was he holding back in all of his other fights? Takiko sweated as his trained eyes struggled even to follow the assassin's shadow. Sensing him was also out of the question. If his presence was faint in the matches prior, then it was now non-existent. At that point, Takiko did the only real thing he could to stop an upcoming attack. And that was to allow his adamantite sealing chains to sprout out of his back, effectively forming a shield against any attack from behind as they whipped around dangerously, breaking apart many of the afterimages that the assassin had formed. In an instant, Tatsuko was already in front of Takiko, who shrunk back in surprise. He barely managed to lean out of the way of a blade. He only managed to do so by using one of his chains to drag himself backwards on pure instinct whilst pushing the others forward to stab his opponent and bind him. But the one-legged devil was done playing around. He immediately vanished and Takiko felt a powerful palm strike hit him in the back, causing him to spit out some blood and get sent tumbling in the other direction. Tatsuko smiled, not bothering to follow up his attack as he brought one of his hands up in a simple sign. Crimson Seal. In that same instant, strange markings spread through Takiko's body as the Crimson Seal sought to envelop the body, its starting point being where Tatsuko had just placed his palm. In an instant, Takiko's eyes widened. He instinctively stopped using the chains, as he felt a burning sensation within his blood whilst the seal spread. Fighting back only made things worse, which left him tumbling on the ground after receiving that palm strike. He seemed shocked, staring at the ground with wide eyes as he took some deep breaths in. Just like that, you are no longer able to use chakra. At least not without paying a good price for it. Tatsuko smiled, his voice having an almost melodic ring to it as he hopped towards his opponent leisurely. Back in the stands, Yorihiko was already up from his seat, looking at the arena below with an angered gaze. Shit, that careless child. The Uzumaki leader was not mad at Tatsuko for using such a tactic. it was in fact the smartest thing to do in that situation, aside from outright stabbing his pupil in the heart from the back. But still, an Uzumaki prodigy falling victim to one of their very own Fuinjutsu techniques was beyond shameful. It can't be helped. The one-legged devil had not showcased any mastery over Fuinjutsu up to this point. Seems like he's got quite a few hidden cards. The Hokage immediately pacified him, realizing how bad things looked. He should not have put himself in such a situation in the first place. The Raikage scowled, having expected a lot more from the final fight. I've heard of that seal before. It is quite detrimental to any shinobi, so I guess it's fair to call the fight? Mifune stroked his beard, slowly eyeing Tatsuko with an impressed gaze. As expected of Lord Ken's star pupil, he already is in a league of his own among his generation. No. The fight isn't over. Ken's voice rang out from the side at the time, just as the leaders were about to signal to the announcer to end the fight. Hey now, I get that he was disrespectful to you, but continuing would just be torture at this stage. The Raikage seemed a bit disappointed in his friend. You think I'd have such petty intentions over some childish spat? As an Uzumaki, Takehiko still has the chance to overcome this. All he needs is for his opponent to be distracted a bit. Right, Yorihiko? The blind assassin's head turned towards the Uzukage, who seemed to nod hesitantly before shaking his head. But who's to say his opponent will give him the chance to recover? Whatever. We'll let this play out a bit more, and see what his next move is. I'll just intervene if his life is in danger. Back in the arena, Tatsuko hadn't bothered to approach his opponent faster. He seemed to be humming to himself, thinking to had already won the fight, which in all fairness, he may as well have. Takehiko's gaze turned hateful and defiant for a moment. He immediately raised his arm and formed a simple hand sign. In that instant, Tatsuko's relaxed demeanor vanished, and just before the Uzumaki prodigy's chakra moved through the right channels to finish the jutsu, he was already pointing a blade at his throat. Stop! Just accept that you've lost. Even if you can douse yourself in water and stem the burning of the Crimson Seal, you can't fight me in your current state. Without your change you are nothing. Tatsuko's voice was harsh and unforgiving, but he was not lying in any way. And that was the reason why Takehiko couldn't even refute it. From the moment I saw you fight in the preliminaries, I knew that fighting you would be easy. Even if you've changed a bit since then, you can't possibly change a lifetime of bad habits and lack of preparation with a week or two of carefulness. Tatsuko ignored his opponent's grim expression as he continued speaking whilst sheathing his blade. The announcer had also already gone ahead and shouted out the obvious winner of the battle, but Takehiko didn't hear a single word of it. He was too stuck in the words of his opponent. Maybe a few weeks back, he would have considered all of it as his opponent talking smack about him, but in a sense, he also realized his negligence during the Chunin exams. If I had trained a bit harder in Fuinjutsu, none of this would have happened. If I worked harder in general, I would have maybe even won. He was already beaten down, not even realizing that his opponent had already walked away, undoing the seal with a simple hand sign before heading off. Takehiko. A familiar voice was the only one able to break him out of his trance. It was none other than the voice of his teacher and mentor, the leader of the Uzumaki clan, Yorihiko. The red-haired man looked at his protege with a conflicted gaze, before sighing and shaking his head. We will have to revise your training schedule when we get back. For now, let us enjoy the festivities. Unlike what many people in the crowd expected, the Uzukage didn't lash out at his student, he just waved him off, pushing him to leave the arena before turning back and jumping towards the seats. Letting that match go on was a bad idea, he said, before sitting back down. Well, I can see why Ken would want it to go on at least. The Raikage stroked his thick beard with a wry smile on his face. Why? To further humiliate my pupil? His spirit's already broken enough. Yorihiko's voice sounded a bit offended. He sent the red dot a rather fiery glare. He didn't seem hostile in any way, however, just frustrated. Nah, he just gave your pupil a chance. Anything can happen in a battle, it's not like the Crimson Seal cannot be overcome. If that was the case, you Uzumaki bastards would have already conquered the world, haha. The Raikage laughed a bit, before looking at Ken with an appreciative gaze. Humiliation was not the intended outcome of this battle, but it can't be called a bad outcome either. Takehiko got to learn a tough lesson today. You just have to make sure that he works on himself from now on, and develops from here. Ken turned his head towards Yorihiko as he spoke. Hearing his reasoning, the incensed Uzukage could just sigh. He couldn't exactly start arguing with his clan's benefactor, now could he? The Hokage slowly stood up at that point as well, and he addressed everyone in the arena at once. I will take this moment to once again congratulate all of this exam's participants for their amazing displays of skill. I must say, the future is looking blinding at this stage. Ho-Oh, as always, the Hokage's voice and charm had an almost magnetic pull to it, instantly capturing the attention of everyone present. To the winner, number 1 of the Brotherhood, the title of Chunin does not mean much. As many of you know, the Dark Brotherhood ranks its assassins differently. It is due to that, his reward will be decided personally by Ken upon their return to their compound. The crowd nodded, seemingly accepting that outcome, although many were a bit disappointed, wanting to know what spoils would go to the victor. But the Hokage's next sentence quickly made them forget that thought. In regards to the Chunin promotion, everyone that has made it to the semifinals and finals of this year's competition will be officially promoted to the Chunin rank, as we have deemed them to be deserving enough. The investors seemed to be quite pleased at that, many of them clapping loudly with smiles on their faces. After all, being Chunin meant that they were going to be allowed to go on more important missions. Many in the finals had showcased a level of skill that impressed them, so they felt good knowing that their missions and tasks were going to be handled by the skillful next generation. Regardless, their cheering only got louder at the Hokage's next words. Without further ado, for this exam's final showcase, we shall have a battle between Lord Ken, leader of the Dark Brotherhood, and Lord A, third Raikage of the Cloud Village. Chapter 174, The Strongest, Fight and Going All Out. The Raikage huffed, compressed steam came out of his lips as his muscles flexed and relaxed repeatedly. He now stood in front of what was likely going to be one of the most difficult opponents of his life. None other than his very best friend, and someone he saw as family, Ken. Unlike others, he didn't think of Ken as a contender for the title of the God of Shinobi. He saw such titles as needless in front of his talent. After all, Hiruzen was a holder of that title, and he, at least in the Raikage's eyes, didn't deserve it. To the Raikage, Ken was simply the strongest creature. And certainly, the strongest creature he had ever faced so far in his long life. The Eight Tails paled in comparison to the pressure that the masked assassin could put on him just with his mere presence. But that's what makes this all the more enjoyable. The Raikage looked at the arena surrounding them. Although large, it felt as if it could barely contain the excitement of the warriors within it. The people in the stands, the investors, and the other leaders were all silent. The contestants of the Chunin exams, as well as many from the younger generations of Konoha, were also present, all looking in silence, anxiety, and great anticipation. The Raikage's eyes eventually landed on the very source of his excitement. The cloaked and masked man that stood right in front of him was unmoving like a statue, yet maddeningly intimidating. Any lesser man would have had their hearts filled with fear at just the sight of him, the way that the blades of grass around him seemed to lean away from him. Well then, let us enjoy this thoroughly. The cold and raspy voice also further accentuated that sight, but the Raikage was unshaken. He knew that, in any battle, half of the fight was psychological. And it was obvious to anyone with a good pair of eyes that Ken was already a master of it. But the Raikage was also no slouch. With a wide and crooked smile, lightning covered the entirety of his body, his fingers clenching, forming a tightened fist. Looking at the scene and taking in the atmosphere almost made Minato, as well as the rest of the younger generation watching, take a few steps back. Of course, the yellow-haired child was beside Kushina, so he wouldn't allow himself to take a step back under any circumstance, but it was still putting a lot of stress on him. No blows had been exchanged yet. But the first one to move this time was surprisingly Ken. He zoomed forward, his long sword drawn and slashing at the Raikage, who recoiled back for a second before moving his clenched fist to block the blade. Sparks arose as the fist and blade collided, but for the first exchange, it seemed that the Raikage was winning, as Ken was being slowly pushed backwards. Ken immediately kicked out, his leg whipping the Raikage's side heavily, cracking the arena all around them, but not moving the Raikage in any way. The assassin was however able to use the Raikage's torso as a foothold to roll to the side, dodging a lightning spear which pierced the dirt at unbelievable speeds. I was somewhat hoping to test my base speed a bit more. But the Raikage isn't someone I can take lightly. The red dot's body immediately seemed to shift. His muscles underneath his coat expanded as his skin became covered with scales. Heh. Finally! That's what I wanted to see. The Raikage immediately appeared in front of Ken, hand already outstretched. This time, however, Ken was able to react to his speed much better. Before the Raikage even realized it, the assassin was standing on his fist, stopping there for a flicker of a second before his transformed leg moved. The Raikage's head was immediately whipped backwards, as Ken's kick sent the Raikage flying. The assassin followed that up immediately, reaching the Raikage's side and punching him hard towards the temple. This time, however, the Raikage managed to put his hand up and block it. Regardless of him blocking that strike, the Raikage was still shot towards the wall of the arena faster than a bullet leaving the smoking barrel of a gun. The Raikage immediately shot back out, appearing in front of Ken almost as if the wall of the arena was a spring. A wide smile could be seen on his unharmed face as he formed his infamous Hell Spear, pointing one finger at Ken's chest. The blind assassin didn't allow himself to get hit that easily, despite being able to just regenerate. His entire body tilted to the side, the tip of the spear narrowly passing by underneath his armpit. As he leaned to the side, he flexed his arm and slightly raised it, faking a punch as the tip of one of his clawed feet dug into the ground and immediately kicked upwards, sending a large rock directly at the Raikage's head once more. The Cloud Village leader headbutted the large rock, effectively disintegrating it. In doing so, however, he had left himself blinded for just a fraction of a second. Ken immediately took advantage of that, his spiked tail piercing out, aiming straight for the Raikage's chest. The tip of the tail crashed against the lightning-covered chest. The Raikage's eyes widened as he felt something unfamiliar. The tip of Ken's tail pierced the skin and seemed to try and go deeper into the muscle, but the Raikage immediately jumped backwards, reaching the wall in an instant while stopping for a second, touching his now slightly bleeding chest. Tatsuko and the rest of the children of the Brotherhood were completely transfixed, seeing their father fight seriously for the first time. It felt strangely enlightening, especially to the one-legged devil. They were seeing the very pinnacle of the fighting style they had been developing for such a long time. The others of the younger generation could barely follow the battle with their eyes. The Uchiha and Hyuga had an advantage, but even they could not keep up with the fight. Still, just from the cracked arena ground, and the sounds of wind and dirt breaking, they could tell that the battle was fierce. Takehiko also couldn't help but sweat, as his eyes struggled to catch up with the afterimages of the movements of the monsters in the arena. Still, he was good enough to somewhat understand the core of Ken's fighting style. And it was scary. Efficiency, viciousness, and non-standard attacks all combined into one, to form a beautifully efficient dance. A dance that would, against any normal person, lead to a perfect assassination. But, as already established, the Raikage was the furthest thing from normal. Good. Great! I'll be going all out then. Didn't even seem to care about the slight wound on his chest, solely focusing on Ken, whilst the lightning around his body took on a darker shade. Didn't think you'd be using that in such a stage. Thought it was a secret technique or something. Although Ken's voice sounded relaxed, his entire body was tensed up, realizing that he was going to have to deal with an opponent faster than himself. Ha! I never bothered to hide this form. It's just that no one had survived it previously to spread the word about it. That Raikage was the first to live after seeing this, by sheer luck though. Shame, I had such a good track record till then. The Raikage rolled his shoulder, his entire body now covered in rolling and crackling black lightning. I must say, my blood is boiling. Ken's feral excitement finally crawled to the surface, escaping the assassin's usual calm visage, as the two monsters both stepped forward, turning into afterimages before clashing in the middle of the arena. In that very instant, the entire arena shook. It felt as if an earthquake was trying to bury it in its entirety within a sinkhole. But the two fighters were not focused on the ground, only on each other. Only 3 moves were exchanged, but in those 3 moves, Ken's arm flew off, and the assassin rolled off to the side, avoiding yet another deadly sharp punch. Ken immediately understood that he couldn't physically overcome the Raikage in that form. He could still react to his speed, but A's strength was enhanced to an inhuman level. The Raikage immediately appeared behind Ken, as the latter was crouched on the ground, his arms still regrowing. The assassin seemed to have anticipated that, his entire body already tilted to the side, in the process of dodging the strike. A dark hell spear immediately pierced the ground where Ken had stood, grazing his legs slightly, but not causing any significant damage. Ken used that opportunity to heavily strike the ground with his tail, raising a cloud of dust and completely covering the Raikage's view, at least for a second. I immediately punched the ground underneath him hard, causing another small earthquake and pushing all of the dust away to reveal his opponent. On the other side of the arena was the monstrous form of his opponent. Ken's cloak was already down, his muscly scaled arm was regrown, and he now stood at his full height facing the Raikage with confidence. Grasped within both of his hands was a thin and long blade, which sparkled with chakra, and the assassin took on a stance and pointing the tip of the blade at the ground slightly. This is the first time I've seen him take up the blade in that form. A bead of sweat appeared on the Raikage's forehead briefly before evaporating from the heat. Sure, he remembered Ken playing around in his monster form against some cultists before, using their own weapons against them. But this was the first time the Raikage witnessed Ken going all out, using his skills to the fullest with a legendary blade. The very prospect of it was enough to make the blood in his veins boil further. Show me how much you've grown. Chapter 175, Sword and Spear, Dance and Ending. The moment Ken picked up that sword, it wasn't just his stance that changed, but the entire atmosphere around him. Just in his transformation, he seemed to release an aura that was beast-like, almost feral even. It made it difficult for any opponent to keep his composure completely, only someone on the Raikage's level could manage that. But the moment he grabbed his sword again, that feral aura shifted entirely. For a moment, it felt as if it lowered in intensity, but it gave off a much more controlled and dangerous sensation. It was a sharpness that could be felt even in the wind around him. And everyone in the arena could feel it. Takiko trembled a bit when seeing that. That thing was supposed to be in the same generation as us? His teacher, Yorihiko, had tried to discourage him from comparing himself to Ken in the past. But his stubbornness still made him think that he had a chance to catch up. That he was somehow not that far behind from the strongest. But the scene in front of him made it clear that Ken was not a member of his generation. He was a beast that transcended any common understanding. The children of the Brotherhood already knew that very well. They were only really there to admire their father's strength. Minato and Kushina also knew that Ken was a monster, but the following exchange was still going to leave them aghast. The first one to move was the Raikage, his superior speed being showcased as he appeared in front of Ken, his finger already outstretched in a sharp dark lightning spear. Ken's reaction time seemed to be on point this time, however. He swiped the spear with the hilt of his blade and took a wide swing at the Raikage in the same move. The Raikage's body immediately shifted, as he raised his leg up to block the blade with his shin guard. He could try to block it with his body, but he, for some reason, felt as if Ken's strikes weren't that easy to block. The blue chakra around Ken's blade immediately came in contact with the Raikage's black lightning-covered shin. Sparks didn't fly this time, there was no metallic clang, but the clash of chakra in itself sent lightning crashing through the area all around them. The slash that Ken sent didn't seem to damage the Raikage's body, but the sheer remnants of it were enough to send a sharp shockwave all around them, cutting the arena around them evenly. The walls weren't just scratched, no, they were entirely cut through. If someone strong enough was to push them, the upper side would slide off of the foundation. In the stands above, the Hokage sweated a bit. Good thing I called every shinobi in the village to maintain the arena during the fight. And he was right to do so, as the fighters below spared no thought to the stone walls surrounding them, both being closed off in their own world. The Raikage's arm moved to the side, aiming to cut at Ken's head with the side of his spear. But Ken's wrist also moved, sending a strange tremor through his blade. The lightning-covered man grunted for a moment as he felt a strange vibration through his shin, which forced him to stop any ongoing attack and dash backwards, his legs slightly trembling. An attack that goes through my guard? Ken craned his neck as he held his blade to the side. The vibrations he had sent through it were, of course, the technique of the former #1 assassin in his previous world. It had been difficult for Ken to master sending vibrations through his blade, but over the years, he managed to master it to a point where he could use it effectively in combat. And truly, it was the only way that he could confidently damage the Raikage in his current form. Using nature energy was also a method, but Ken would have to use a whole lot of it to go through the Raikage's defenses and deal any meaningful damage, which would likely take him out of his skilled sage mode, leaving him vulnerable if I was to still be able to fight. But while the Raikage was somewhat surprised, and the watchers couldn't quite understand what had happened, the following exchange was still exhilarating. Ken dashed forward, both of his hands on the hilt of his blade as it moved so fast that it felt as if a slash was being delivered both horizontally and vertically at the same time. The Raikage's eyes followed it before they widened as he batted one slash to the side with his lightning spear and leaned back avoiding the strike. Whilst dashing, Ken seemed to have pulled a sleight of hand trick and transformed his long blade into two identically long and thin blades. The Raikage's speed was superior to Ken's, but some of his senses still fell behind when compared to the blind assassin. The human eye simply was not built to follow certain movements, especially when they were deliberately deceitful. The length of Ken's second blade was certainly deceitful, as it expanded to still hit the Raikage's chest, despite him leaning backwards. A's eyes widened as the vibrations within the blade shook the muscles underneath his skin. The Raikage's knee-jerk reaction was to immediately kick at Ken's head, forcing the assassin to raise both of his blades to barely block the strike. He was sent flying to the other side of the arena, only to spin around in midair and dig his blades into the ground, stopping his momentum before his back even touched the ruined wall. The Raikage grasped at his chest for a moment. The vibration that the blind assassin unleashed with only one hand didn't seem strong enough to penetrate his muscle, but it still did some internal damage. Ken's next move was simple. He started to sway in the wind in a certain pattern, his blades and footwork moving in unison to create something akin to a dance. His footsteps resonated with the trembling of the ground caused by shinobi raising earth walls around the arena. His blades vibrated with each swipe, creating something akin to a melodic hum as they danced through the wind. Each slash, each swipe of the edge, every move that Ken made seemed to leave a mark on the wind around him, almost as if the very air around him was permanently scarred. In the stands, Mifune's eyes widened. As a swordsman, he couldn't help but admire the masterpiece unfolding in front of him. A dance that led to a painting that seemed to form what was likely the greatest display of swordsmanship that the old samurai had ever seen in his life. I knew he was a monster. But this is too much. Although serene, the dance was so fast that the Raikage didn't even get to dash towards the blind swordsman after recovering. Instead, the two blades in Ken's hands swiped in every direction as countless flying slashes were sent out towards the Raikage. The Raikage immediately scowled and covered his head with his hand while stepping forward. He was unable to dash forward, as the moment both of his feet left the ground he would be sent flying like a piece of wood bark in a tornado. Whilst moving slowly, there were also more possibilities for him to counter any surprise attack from Ken. Each step felt heavier as the flying slashes pelted his body more and more. But he wasn't receiving injuries. The flying slashes were just there to suppress the Raikage, likely to cover his view as the assassin prepared for a killing blow. At least he thought so. In the middle of all of those countless slashes, one sent a shiver down the Raikage's spine, but he didn't have the time to move, nor could he. In an instant, a thin line was formed on his torso, a flying slash penetrating his lightning armor violently and leaving a thin cut on his body. It was not deep enough to be called serious, but it was not the only one. The falling barrage contained all manner of cuts, both with and without nature energy imbued within them, and the Raikage slowly but surely collected more and more scratches, to the point where they were starting to bleed. And it was at that point that the Raikage gave up on his initial slower approach. Petty tricks! In an instant, the Raikage lashed out, smashing his fist into the ground, sending a great tremor through the earth as an explosion of black lightning hit the arena and created a shockwave large enough to stop the assassin's deadly dance. Petty tricks indeed. The Raikage heard that voice from behind him, but his reaction time fell behind. He tried to raise his arm above his head, but it only twitched for a moment as he felt the blunt part of a blade hit the top of his head heavily. Don't forget, you are fighting a swordsman and an assassin here. Those were the last words the Raikage heard, as the vibration pierced through his defense and immediately shook his brains around in his skull. The large man's eyes rolled backwards, and his body limply crashed into the ground, unconscious and bleeding from the nose and eyes. Ken's body was also shaking, his muscles contracting unnaturally and healing from burns as he had forced himself to rush into the explosion of black lightning that the Raikage had released. It was the only way that the assassin could think of to take out the Raikage effectively. Without being taken by surprise, the Cloud Leader would have defended his head on all occasions. While vibrations through the body could wear the Raikage down eventually, Ken didn't wish for a prolonged battle. Their little showdown was nothing more than a spar at the end of the day. The Dark Brotherhood leader stood there for 1 second, black lightning still flickering around him. And then the cheers broke through, as the winner became clear to everyone. Most of them couldn't appreciate the deadly and morbid beauty of Ken's sword dance just because of how far outmatched they were in comparison. Very few could even follow Ken and A's movements enough to make out what had happened in the first place. It had taken a second for all of them to catch up to what had happened. Many could barely follow the fight with their eyes, but that made it all the more impressive to them. It seems the winner has been decided. I believe both fighters deserve a round of applause, an amazing display of strength. The Hokage's voice broke through, as the cheers intensified from all of the people present. Only one person in the arena seemed more concerned than cheerful. And that was Yujito Ni. Despite not being treated all too well by her village, the Raikage was a great exception to that. Many feared Jinchuriki due to their own weakness. Weakness was something that the Raikage lacked, which allowed him to form a proper bond with the little girl. He was a goal in her mind, a great mentor. And seeing him bloody on the ground was like a nightmare to her. Thankfully, no words were needed to comfort her, as the Raikage's resilience and endurance were enough to reassure her. The Cloud Leader woke up almost immediately when the audience started cheering, just as Ken wrapped his blade back up in a bandage and placed it on his back. The Raikage's brains were still scrambled a bit, as he shakily raised his torso from the ground, supported by his arm as he heaved a heavy sigh. Shit, that was dirty, Ken. The Raikage grunted, clutching at his head as soon as his upper body stood upright enough to no longer need his hand for support. That's how I fight. It was great regardless. The assassin shrugged, tilting his head at the Raikage with a smile spreading underneath his mask. What a monster. Most people would be knocked out for weeks after receiving such a blow to the head. Despite winning the fight, Ken was still impressed with the Raikage. A's tenacity was certainly deserving of respect. I also respected Ken a lot and already knew that he'd lose the battle, so he had no objection. But his appreciation and respect for Ken rose when the blind assassin extended his burly scaled arm towards him. Smiling, the Raikage took it and allowed himself to be pulled up from the ground. The audience also seemed to appreciate the sight, as it further proved how close-knit the Three Corners alliance was. A deep friendship between the leaders was always a good sign. And just like that, the Chunin exams ended with a bang. Chapter 176, Celebration, Departure, and Rewards. After the end of the Chunin exams, festivities ensued. Unlike previous years where everyone just went their own ways, and the exams were used only really to scope out potential threats of potential enemies, this was now something made among allies only. The investors and the participants were now finding themselves enjoying a festival in the middle of Konoha. It was to celebrate both the Chunin exams and the union of the many powers of the alliance. Needless to say, it all left a very good image in the eyes of the investors, one that couldn't have been faked. True unity. Sure, the Raikage and the Uzukage seemed to not like each other, but they were in good terms with everyone else, and they all seemed to appreciate seeing the younger generations interact with each other. Many were expecting Ken to be the quiet man overseeing everything, but he was in fact the one binge drinking with Mifune and the Rage in the middle of the street. It had become a contest between the three of them at some point. The first one to lose was Mifune, his stomach somewhat smaller than his opponent's. The Raikage and Ken drank and laughed for the rest of the night. Both of them were more beast than human in many ways it seemed. Maybe couldn't transform or anything like that, but his body had long since transcended that of regular humans through constant tempering and use of the lightning cloak. Takehiko stuck close to his teacher/mentor, sometimes glancing at Ken with a bit of fear in his eyes. He now knew that comparing himself to Ken was foolish, but he hoped that his outburst from the preliminaries hadn't offended Ken too badly. Unbeknownst to him, Ken hadn't been offended at all. He wanted to help him learn more about the world. He, much like Yorihiko, saw the potential within the young Uzumaki prodigy. But unlike Yorihiko, Ken also could see the flaws within the young man. He knew that letting him go into the world with his mindset would only lead to his untimely death. In the past, he wouldn't have really cared. Even if the Uzumaki were his allies currently, things could change in the future, and he wouldn't have felt the need to go out of his way to help their future generation grow stronger. But, as he was currently, he understood that having allies was something to cherish, not something to act weary about. Even snakes could become loyal forever if fed properly. And having an ally out in the world always gave one more leisure and options in the face of adversity. Even Saburo, despite being with the Brotherhood only for his own reasons, he had proven his loyalty time and time again. He was still only there because it was most convenient, but Ken could trust that he wouldn't ever leave at that point. He had tied every facet of his life to the lab within the Dark Brotherhood's compound. He had already managed to stick himself to the strongest person around. He had no rhyme or reason to ever leave. Ken had already proven that he could fight back even if the entire world turned against him. Saburo trusted his strength so much that he didn't even feel the need to have an escape plan like he had in the grass village. He had become a reliable ally, much like everyone else within the Three Corners Alliance. And finally, Ken could see his goal almost completed. Temporary peace. Now it was all about maintaining that peace. They had a monopoly over power in the elemental nations, but they still needed to sustain themselves. Trade routes were already being established, and it was just a matter of time before they became truly self-sufficient. Every investor could see and understand that when feeling the unity of the alliance during the Chunin exams. And so, they were incentivized to try and prove their allegiance to the Three Corners Alliance as well, by providing them with contracts, donations, and help with expanding the trade routes. Things were already snowballing, and by the time Ken and the Dark Brotherhood left for their compound, everything was looking great. To the point where even the sanctions that some nobles tried to put on them weren't going to matter anymore. Reaching the compound was much easier, as Tasho and Saburo were able to just reverse summon them there instantly. The children of the Brotherhood rejoiced when seeing their siblings and father return. A small celebration happened there as well, but everyone quieted down when Ken clapped his hands. As you all know, the Chunin exam winner is none other than our Tatsuko, number 1 between you children. Ken's calming voice soothed the ears of the many listeners as he paced on a small earthen podium that Tasho, the first blade, had risen underneath him. The children cheered once more when hearing that, many looking at Tatsuko with pride. He, much like all of them, started from the ground. No even worse due to his disability. But despite all of that, he was able to become what was essentially the best in his generation within the Three Corners Alliance. Even the new recruits had taken to seeing him as a role model. An example that, no matter how bad things were, they could always get better. Talent notwithstanding, Tatsuko would not have gotten anywhere were it not for his hard work, determination, and character. Unlike many who would use their disability as an excuse, he has overcome it and even manages to use it to his advantage. This is something that even I admire. Ken's speech voiced out the thoughts of the children perfectly. Those in the older generations had seen it and had passed down the tales to the younger ones. But starting up, Tatsuko was struggling to even stand on his own, let alone fight. And yet, through tears, gritted teeth and sheer determination, he had now become the best among them. No matter how talented one was, without the right mindset they would never get far. Tasho was a good example of that. His talent had been completely wasted before Ken found him and polished him into a fine gem. It is due to this, due to your hard work and character, that I have decided to officially promote you to the status of the 4th Blade. You will, from now on, lead a squad of numbered of your own, into missions of your choosing. You have earned my trust. As he spoke, Ken slowly pulled out a mask from his coat, a white mask with 4 red slashes painted on it, going right down the middle. Upon seeing it, Tatsuko couldn't help but tear up. It was gratifying, all of his efforts being rewarded with the recognition he very much deserved. He was so emotional that he hadn't even realized that Ken was sitting in front of him, with the mask extended for what must have been a full minute. "What are you doing, jackass? Take your mask." A voice broke him out of his trance. It was none other than Morita, who patted him on the back with a smile on his face. Out of everyone, he knew best just how much Tatsuko deserved the promotion. He deserved to become one of the Blades. Putting aside all of their competition for Ken's attention, all of the bad emotions that Morita might have had in the past, the number 2 assassin still held a huge amount of respect for his rival. Hearing his voice, Tatsuko couldn't help but smile underneath his currently blank mask. He slowly reached out and took the mask from his father's outstretched palm. "Congratulations. Let us celebrate the birth of a new blade." Ken immediately rose his hand to the other children, who were essentially just waiting for the cue to break into cheers. Dozens rushed to Tatsuko, picking him up and throwing him in the air with smiles on their now unmasked faces. The 4th Blade now also took off his empty mask and laughed with his siblings, a happy smile stretching across his face. The festivities lasted for a full day. The children were all exempt from training, and they were allowed to enjoy a buffet of good food, courtesy of Saburo's now improved cooking skills. For drinks they had homemade grape juice. They were bought grapes, of course, but the Brotherhood was certainly going to have its own vineyard, seeing as the children all liked grape juice, and Ken liked wine, which was just old grape juice. After the festivities were all over, Ken took Tatsuko to the side. They both walked through a maze of underground tunnels, reinforced with support pillars and stonework that seemed to be made by artists. They eventually reached a door, guarded by 2 intimidating-looking masked men. 2 of Saburo's strongest clones were on either side of that door. And it seemed that the gigantic stone door was so heavy that it required Ken himself to step forward and open it up. Tatsuko walked into what could have only been called a weapon nut's wet dream. A gigantic room filled with all manner of strange mechanisms and weapons. Blades of varying qualities adorned the walls, all shining and reflecting as the room itself seemed to be lit up by strange stones stuck to the roof of it. The collection easily held a few thousand weapons, far more than there were hands to use them within the Brotherhood. At least for now, welcome, 4th Blade, to the new and improved Dark Brotherhood Armory. Ken officially addressed Tatsuko by his title as he continued walking deeper into the armory. They eventually reached the furthest corner of the room, and 4 distinct blades were placed on display, on different pedestals. There were 7 pedestals in total, but some were missing. The Nuibari, sewing needle, the Kiba, twin swords/fangs, the Kabutawari, helmet splitter, and the Shibuki, scroll blade. Take your pick. As an official blade, you have the option of choosing one of our greatest weapons. Ken's voice broke Tatsuko out of his musings as he admired the masterpieces that were currently in front of him. The Nuibari? I thought that was used blade. The 4th Blade mused while studying the sewing needle with a curious gaze. It has been confiscated from her temporarily as a punishment. I'm sure you know that she is currently under house arrest for her outbursts. Ken had called taking the Nuibari away a temporary measure. But he wouldn't mind giving it to Tasho. Maybe it could serve as a good lesson for you after all. But the blind swordsman already knew that Tatsuko wasn't going to pick the sewing needle. It simply wasn't his style. Tatsuko paced the room a bit, inspecting all of the blades, before reaching for and picking up the one that Ken expected the least. So it's the explosive scroll blade in the end, huh? Ken smiled underneath his mask, already imagining the types of moves one could pull with Tatsuko's fighting style coupled with the blade's explosions. It just seems like the best option here, father. Tatsuko nodded, still referring to Ken as his father. That fact hadn't changed despite his raise in rank. The two of them were closer than ever now. Ken really did see him as his own son, not that he saw the other children in the Brotherhood much differently, but he was as proud as one could be when looking at Tatsuko. Unfortunately, the same could not be said about you. Who was so bitter about her punishment that she hadn't even bothered to celebrate Tatsuko's advancement with the others. Ken sighed when sensing her brooding in her own room, looking at the pile of books that she now had to read as an assignment. I'll leave her alone for now. Try to put my mind elsewhere. Ken slowly paced his office. The gigantic clipboard on the side of the room was filled with notes about each and every ally that Ken had gathered, information, likes and dislikes. Everything was noted down perfectly, and eventually, his hand traced a note that had little details. I guess it's time to fill in some blanks, huh? And that note was regarding his biological family. Chapter 177, Bloodline Database, Clans, and Trip. The database of bloodlines had been an experiment that Saburo had worked on quite half-heartedly. He still put the bare minimum of effort in, as it was a direct request of Ken, who was his boss. Progress was slow, and creating a machine to test samples against the database was a difficult and laborious process. Of course, a brilliant mind like Saburo's could do it, but he was simply not that invested in it. At least not at first. His interest grew exponentially around the time he received a specific DNA sample. One from a very obscure clan known as the Mo clan. What exactly was so particular about this clan's bloodline? Well, nothing really. They were not strong, they were not even average, they were incredibly weak. Not one notable figure in their entire clan's existence, at least not any documented ones. But one fact about them stood out. They were extinct. That's right, that small insignificant clan which had gone extinct during the Warring States period was what finally sparked Saburo's interest. It seemed that the merchant association that Ken had contracted to gather the DNA samples was going far beyond the original intended scope, seeking to fulfill his request to the fullest extent possible. Ichiraku was nothing if not a completionist, and improving his relationship with Ken seemed like a natural progression to keep his businesses and deals safe. Through that small insignificant clan, Saburo realized the true potential of a thorough bloodline database. A place containing information on all clans that ever existed, containing DNA samples of every clan which could even allow one to clone them and possibly bring back disappeared clans and bloodline limits. Of course, creating a body from scratch using just a faded DNA sample was impossible with their current technology. But in the future? Oh, the future held a lot of surprises, and Saburo was sure that it would be done eventually. And eventually, as well, someone would be able to artificially mix those bloodlines. Being able to mix the strongest bloodlines to create a perfect vessel. The perfect clone. Saburo was almost getting aroused at the idea. Sure, he had no way of knowing if mixing more than two bloodlines was even possible, but what if it was in the future? Essentially, the more bloodlines came in, the more excited Saburo became as he started theorizing more about the possibilities and potential of the database's future uses. Despite his brilliant mind, his general disinterest had led to him being a bit slow on the uptake, as Ken had already been thinking of those possibilities for a while now. Of course, he was more one to worry about the database getting into the wrong hands, but as long as it was under his protection it would be fine. Ken did consider outright deleting it from existence after it served its purpose in finding his biological family and clans of origin, but he decided against that. The potential for good with such an invention was almost too good to pass up. At the end of the day, bad actors in the future could simply go and collect DNA samples in the wild and play the mixing game with them. Having a pristine and clinical database would just make things much easier for them. The possibility of documenting old extinct clans was one of the many uses of the database. Ichiraku had gone ahead and told his people to bring in old DNA samples they could find too, to look for people with interesting family names in graveyards. Dug-up battlefields in the warring states were also able to tell a story of its own. They now had knowledge of clans that had managed to wipe each other out, clans that had petered out and broken off into smaller clans as their bloodlines diluted. So much history had been buried in those DNA markers, and it was all unwinding in front of Saburo. The strawman was not as interested in the history of it as he was in the practical applications of the project, but he still found everything at least mildly interesting now. The most exhilarating moment was when Saburo actually used the bloodline database for the first time, with his own blood. With that, he found that he was closely linked with one clan that was currently mostly extinct and that his roots stretched far back, older unnamed clans that they had very little information on. Still, Saburo was pleased with the results, which meant that he could now go on with the task that had been assigned to him. Running Ken's beastly blood through the DNA database was not as laborious a process as previously thought, but the results were certainly not within Saburo's expectations. What the hell is this? The most prevalent markers said that Ken's parents were part of a reclusive clan, the Ashura clan. It was a remote place somewhere off in the Land of Keys, a small village which housed all of the members of the clan. There were plenty of stories about them being uncontrollable demons, banished from the nearby hidden village and closing themselves off there to prevent hurting any outsiders. They were documented to be able to transform their bodies completely, presumably by absorbing the natural energy around them and allowing it to alter their bodies. In a sense, it was very similar to Ken's ability, but again, they were not able to control their emotions whilst transforming, going into a berserk state. They had been mostly unheard of since the Warring States period. The Land of Keys had all but forgotten about them, and only some local merchants knew about them, which made it easy for the Merchants Guild to get information on the clan. But Ken being part of the Ashura clan did not seem that surprising when Saburo read about their bloodline limit and affinity for nature energy. Where it became interesting was when Saburo looked into other markers present in the blood. 4.56% Senju clan, 5.25% Uchiha clan, 3.34% Hyuga clan, Sarutobi clan, Kurama clan, Uzumaki clan. What the hell? Saburo looked through the markers, and for some reason, dozens of notable bloodlines mixed in Ken's history. The Warring States period had a lot of blank spots and undocumented moments, but Ken's ties to many clans extended beyond that most likely. Where the anomaly and mutation of Ken most likely originated from was the fact that those ancient mixed bloodlines had somehow become more prevalent within Ken's DNA. If the strawman didn't know any better, then he would have assumed that Ken was created artificially within a lab. But the fact that Ken had memories from shortly after his birth certainly disproved that. That still left the strawman with quite a lot of questions. What exactly were the chances for so many bloodlines to come together, for many ancestors across history to come from these reputable clans? Well, there were a few explanations. It's possible that the Ashura clan was a punching bag in the past, and that they have been raided and plundered by all of these other clans in history. After all, during the Warring States period, lust-related crimes were not only not uncommon, but expected. Whenever a clan won over the other, the women and children would suffer most, not just from having their fathers die. The establishment of the hidden villages by the first Hokage put a stop to that, although the trend somewhat continued on a smaller scale during the many shinobi wars across history. So, it was technically possible for a bloodline like Ken's to appear. Still, Saburo was now curious about testing other living residents of the Ashura clan. If that turned out true, then it was very likely that all of the descendants of the Ashura clan were similar to Ken, but their bloodline mixing granted them no benefits. After all, if there actually were more people like Ken in the world, it's highly unlikely that they'd remain unknown. But there was also another explanation that Saburo saw as equally possible. One of Ken's grandparents, or maybe even parents, was or is an experiment. It was plausible to think that someone in Ken's biological family specifically had been a living result of an experiment. So, either someone tried to play God in the past, likely resulting in a failed experiment containing the dormant DNA markers of a lot of renowned clans which went on to have kids with someone from the Ashura clan. Or complete coincidence caused by war atrocities, with Ken just happening to be the only member of the Ashura clan that has active bloodline markers from all of them. The existence of the Ashura clan raised many questions that Saburo had no real answers for now. Of course, Saburo made sure to include all of his findings within the report he drafted and sent to Ken. And now that the blind assassin had some free time, he made the rather sudden decision to go on a trip to the Land of Keys. Chapter 178, Mad Village, Confusion and Shock. The Land of Keys was not a place Ken was completely unaccustomed to. He had hunted down a band of troublesome criminals at some point on those lands. They were a group really proficient in running away, and they had helped Ken hone his tracking skills inadvertently. There were many moments like those during his bounty hunting journey as a young preteen. Although strong and skillful in the art of assassination, he still had to get used to the new world around him and the many techniques its people employed. Those were very important formative years for him, both for his understanding of the world and for the start of his legend. Smelling the strange plants in the Land of Keys brought Ken back to those times, where he felt more like a dog in the rain stalking rats through vast mountainous expanses. The Land of Keys in itself found itself in a very interesting position, being nestled in the westernmost corner of the large elemental nation's continent, right in between the Land of Mountains and the Land of Birds, two other small nations. The biggest players active in those areas were still the Land of Earth, with the Rock Village, and the Land of Wind, with the Sand Village. There were quite a few smaller nations in between the two, and they had somehow managed to eat up a lot of the more exotic vegetation from the two larger nations. The Land of Wind was mostly desert, so it was the most unfortunate, but the Land of Keys was rather the opposite. The only sand to be found on the Land of Keys was the one present in its vast coastlines, the beach and sea acting like a very nice tourist attraction. Wealthy merchants did like basking in the sun and splashing in the water with their children. They had their private beaches, and the locals all went to more public ones. Ken had not managed to enjoy himself on the beach in his time within the Land of Keys, but he did make a mental note to have a field trip with the Dark Brotherhood at some point. For now, however, he was there on business. He felt no attachment to his biological family, but he still hoped to find some answers about himself from them. Anything really that would explain his somewhat diminishing humanity. At the very least he still had some, even if very little. Without the Brotherhood, I likely would have forsaken any humanity by now. Of course, it wasn't just his Brotherhood. Even people like the Raikage and Mifune, friends he had made along the way. They were all acting like an anchor, helping Ken feel the least bit more human than he actually was. He certainly felt more human than he did in his past life. Even now, when he had changed so much, he still had moments where he relapsed. Back to feeling nothing in particular, back to waiting for the next rush of excitement or dopamine. Currently, he was experiencing one of those moments as he watched the large and thick wooden walls around the village that housed the Shura clan. Rather than housing a clan, it was more fitting to say that they were trapping a clan there. The walls were thicker than 4 trees put together, and they stretched all across the village. There was no gate to speak of. The person who had designed those walls clearly wanted no one to get in or out. Well, it's just a wall anyway. It wasn't enough to keep my parents in. And it certainly wasn't enough to keep someone like Ken out, as he simply jumped over the thick wall in a single leap. Still, there were shinobi around the forests in the area. I guess the hidden village of this land is keeping a close eye on the Shura clan nowadays. Ken's senses washed over the village, something he had refrained from doing up to that point. He wanted to feel everything about the Shura clan, whilst walking right through the heart of its residents. Needless to say, it wasn't all that impressive, and there weren't all that many clan members in the first place. There were traces of constant fighting within the village, and the nature energy within was abundant, though it still felt different from Ken's own. That much was to be expected anyway. Ken was a complete mutant, all things considered. A tailed beast. The village was large, but it genuinely felt almost abandoned, with many residents seemingly shutting themselves off into their own houses, chaining themselves to walls. Entire families were chained in different rooms and interacting through the walls, like happy families. They were seemingly accustomed to their way of life and had found a way to make things work. It felt a bit strange, but Ken already knew about their peculiar bloodline limit. The fact that they entered uncontrolled sage modes was beyond intriguing. Still, it was clear that someone was feeding those who were chained, and eventually Ken stumbled onto the doorstep of the one house that was different from the rest. A house where no one was chained, one where a seemingly regular family resided. "Moom! Can I at least go out to play with some of my friends?" The voice of a teenager made Ken's ears prickle for a bit as he eavesdropped from the other side of the door. "No, Hiroshi. Everyone has already used their time out for the day. Maybe tomorrow." A middle-aged woman's voice responded in a rather serious tone. Her voice sounded familiar to Ken, but he didn't dwell on that for now. Instead, he raised a rhetorical eyebrow as he finally understood the system that the village used to continue existing. But Moom the teenager was still being a troublesome child, but Ken had stopped listening to him, already caught in his own thoughts. Supervised time outside of their chains. A limit was placed to minimize the risk of a bloodbath occurring in the middle of the village. It was rather ingenious. At the very least, the village wasn't just a constant battlefield anymore. Well, it made more sense this way, since they were at least stable enough to be called a village now. "Hiroshi, stop!" An authoritative voice immediately stopped any tantrum spiral that the young boy could have attempted. "You already know that we must do this for everyone's safety. You may have gained control over nature energy to some extent, but the rest of the village isn't so lucky." Ken's ears perked up at that once more. "Don't tell me. Is my biological brother similar to me?" The short answer was no. Ken was able to tell instantly from smell alone. And if his father was even 10% as capable as he was, then he would have already been detected brazenly strolling through the village. It seems he just has some inborn talent for senjutsu. But most regular people can't control nature energy, and it seems the few other residents of the village are all in that category. It had been the same for the children of the Dark Brotherhood too. Some that had joined the classes in senjutsu simply couldn't gain any semblance of control over it, nor could they feel it on their own. It couldn't be helped, it took a certain amount of talent to be able to even briefly control nature energy. Hell, most sages like Jiraiya still barely could. This only really made talents like you and me and those in the top 10 of the numbered all the more valuable. As he settled those thoughts in his mind, the blind assassin slowly knocked on the door. 3 loud creaks from the wooden door made it clear that everyone inside was now alerted to his presence. While I could sneak in, that would be no way to do a family reunion, now would it? The chatter inside the house immediately died down as the creaking of the door resounded within the house. Ken stifled a laugh as he felt the anxiety of the people inside skyrocket. "Go to your room, Hiroshi," Ken heard the father whisper, while he walked closer and closer to the door. The mother of the house also took out a knife and held it behind her back, seemingly preparing for the worst as she walked behind her husband. The moment the door swung open, the burly father of the house immediately tried to punch Ken, much to the latter's surprise. "You shinobi won't be swindling us today." The man spoke, while his fist moved towards Ken almost in slow motion, making the blind monster yawn. Ken just sidestepped the fist and walked into the house leisurely. The mother immediately tried to swipe at his neck with the kitchen knife, but it simply broke against his skin, green scales appearing only for a fraction of a second to block the attack. It had become something instinctual at that point. "TSK. Is that really any way to greet your estranged son?" Ken's long hair swayed as he tilted his head to the side. The father seemed confused, before his gaze finally landed on Ken's mask, and his entire body froze. The mother seemed to have a similar reaction. "Red dot?" Ken sighed when hearing that. "Seems like they've really forgotten about me. Ah well, what can I say, I was nothing more than a very late-term abortion to them. Let's see if they at least remember my face." Chapter 179, Recognition, Regret and Rift. Ken snickered as he stepped over the broken shards of the broken kitchen knife. He felt the fear in his parents. They were afraid of him, it seemed. His reputation preceded him even in such remote places. It couldn't be helped, he was quite literally a legend. Still, how come they never made the connection and realized I am their biological son? Ken's appearance was somewhat well documented by now. At the very least his age and blindness were both well known. Well, I can't blame you for not recognizing me, I guess. Ken slowly headed to the cozy dining/living room, pulling one of the chairs and leisurely sitting down on it, crossing his legs whilst tilting his head. The mother and father of the house were both frozen in fear, realizing that they had made a grave mistake. They only moved when Ken gestured for them to sit down at the table. He then reached for his mask and took it off, placing it gently on the table. His features were revealed, and both of the Shura clan members winced a bit when they saw how scarred it was. A twisted mound of flesh for everything above the nose. Of course, he hadn't always been like that. His nose was only 2 small holes at first, but he decided to morph his body a bit, allowing it to look a bit more human. Having an angled nose also had its own benefits at the end of the day. Does this face of mine look familiar to either of you? Ken still held a smile on his face. His overall tone was gentle and casual. In a sense, he had no way of being disappointed in his interactions with his biological parents, as he never even expected anything from them in the first place. Why you? The mother was the first to react, covering her mouth with her hands whilst her eyes filled with tears. The father's eyes also widened in shock, recognition, and finally, fear. You're our son. He seemed to be speaking more for himself than anything else. But Ken nodded nonetheless, allowing his bangs to move and his hair to cover the upper side of his face. I must say, I was not expecting to sense any tears. If you are afraid that I am here for revenge, then I must say that you are mistaken. Ken crossed his arms, his calm and cordial smile remained plastered on his face. But deep down, he looked down on the both of them. We tried to look for you. We had returned to that mountain. The mother's voice broke through her cries. It seemed that they had ended up regretting their choice of leaving him for dead. But they had failed as parents and human beings by making that choice in the first place. Any regret afterwards was a direct effect of the fact that they had done such a thing. Although Ken could feel that his mother was suffering a bit, he couldn't bring himself to even feel pity for her. We were young and foolish back then. We tried to know. For now, I need to at least say so. Don't bother. I didn't come here to hear a meaningless apology. Ken interrupted his father, ignoring his mother's cries whilst leaning into his chair. Hearing his disinterested voice, his mother's cries seemed to resound a bit harder. Ken could almost feel her heart breaking inside. But at the same time, his mind still clearly remembered it. It wasn't like he was a regular newborn. He had clear memories of every moment since he had gained consciousness in that world. Even without eyes, in his confused state at that time, he felt the lack of sympathy that his parents had for him when they left him for dead on that cold mountain. His mind remembered how his newborn body fought against the biting cold for what felt like an eternity, almost dying before being found by the people who actually deserved to be called his parents. So, even when facing their clear and honest regret, Ken held no sympathy in his heart for them. Seeing them like that only brought a taste of vomit on his tongue. I was curious about how I'd react to them, to see how my human side would react. But it seems that it was a bit of a waste of time. In his monstrous heart, he only had a place for a few people, and all of the spots were filled by the Dark Brotherhood, his dear friends and his actual parents. I will be honest, I did come here to try and find out a bit more about my biological family. Mostly out of curiosity. But my main purpose is to learn more about my clan and bloodline. The mother and father duo seemed to deflate when hearing that, almost as if they had been hoping for a full-on reunion. Too bad, you don't get to shake hands after burning bridges with someone. Dad, Mom, what's happening? Mom, why are you crying? Hiroshi's voice sounded out from behind the parents, as he climbed down the flight of stairs and stared at everyone in shock. His eyes narrowed dangerously as he gave Ken a hostile look. So this must be my twin brother, huh? Ken smiled, his finger tapping on the table as he turned his head back to his parents. Why yes. Hiroshi, come here. Take a seat. The mother immediately urged her son to sit down beside her. In her heart, there was still some hope for Ken to feel some sort of connection to his twin. After all, the child was faultless. Maybe if they get along, then we'd still have a chance to repent properly. Her thought process was rather depressing, but it couldn't be helped. My brother? But wasn't I an only son? Hiroshi's eyes immediately locked back on Ken, this time giving him a confused look, some hostility still lingering. Oh? You never told him. I guess he is too young anyway. I am undoubtedly your twin brother, Hiroshi, was it? Ken extended his hand towards his twin, keeping things cordial, but not too close. He didn't blame his twin for the actions of his parents, but that didn't mean he was looking for a brother. Still, that small action was enough to give a shimmer of hope to the father and mother duo, who watched their son shake hands, meeting for the first time. My name is Ken. My full name is Kyoshi Ken, as given by the parents who raised me. The blind swordsman had not said his full name in a very long time, but he still remembered it. It had been ingrained in his heart after all. Hiroshi's eyes widened. So you were raised by someone else? He was young, and not quite knowledgeable about the outside world or the way it worked. Such innocence and naivety were somewhat endearing to Ken, but he didn't react much, merely humming when hearing the question. Indeed, I was raised by a rather nice group of deserting samurai. It was a nice twist of fate. Ken spoke fondly of his family, remembering them once again, not that he had ever forgotten about them in the first place. But how did they adopt you? And why wasn't I ever told about this? Hiroshi gave his parents a confused look, to which both mother and father looked away in shame. I believe that's a story that your parents should tell you. But let's just say that without the family that raised me, I wouldn't be here right now. That statement only managed to aggravate Hiroshi's curiosity. He immediately turned to his parents once more, this time demanding an explanation. And he got exactly that. Will. At birth, Ken, your twin brother was severely malformed. We didn't think we could raise him, nor did we think he could make it. So we left him near his place of birth. The father was the one to start explaining things, and the mother looked too ashamed even to open her mouth. It should be mentioned that the place of birth was the middle of a deserted mountain, in the middle of winter in the land of iron, where winter is a lot colder than in most other places. Ken made sure to add a few more details to the explanation. After all, if they decided to tell him some parts of the story, he at least deserved to know the whole picture. And it seemed that despite his nativity and innocence, Hiroshi knew enough about the world to understand exactly what Ken meant. His parents hadn't left his deformed twin for adoption. They left him to die in the middle of nowhere. He was left speechless by that realization. He seemed to barely be able to wrap his head around it. But when he finally did, he turned his head back to his parents, hoping that one of them would refute it. But no such thing happened. They were too ashamed to even lie at that point. Ken could feel it, the disgust welling up within his twin's mind as he looked at his parents. But that disgust was a lot more tempered than Ken's own feelings. After all, no matter how much his opinion of them was lowered due to this matter, he was still their son. He had been raised by them for his entire life. Still, Ken didn't need to be a psychologist to realize that a rift had been formed in that small family. Chapter 179, Pragmatism, Bonding and Purpose. It was a sunny day in the land of Keys. Yamada Tomichi, the Kage of the hidden village within that land, couldn't help but take a sip of tea as he enjoyed the view from his window. Their hidden village was a coastal one, being right near a beach, hidden among sand, rocks, and foliage. But despite its natural camouflage, it was still a rather great tourist attraction for many. Some called it the Pearl of the West, a nation so beautiful nestled in between the below-average lands of the rock and the wind. Yamada was immensely proud of his village, especially since he was the son of its founder. The land of Keys formed a bit later than most, as things were still quite messy after the Warring States period for them. It was hard for their land to consolidate enough power to protect itself from the giants surrounding it. Thankfully, they were able to avoid being invaded many times due to their being able to foster good relations with most of their neighbors. Yamada's participation in the Shinobi alliance against the Uzumaki was also a way for him to show his support to the Tsuchikage at the time. Of course, it turned out to be a bust, but Yasuzo was forced to cut his losses in that situation. Thankfully, Inoki had much bigger issues in his hands than picking on a smaller land for abandoning the alliance at that time. So, Yamada was left pretty much unaffected by most issues. He was also one of the lands that didn't participate in the War on the Dark Brotherhood, also called the War of the Greats. The Land of Keys was simply not in any state to get involved in such conflicts. Yamada had put a lot of effort into maintaining the neutrality of his land that entire time. His only real regret was not being able to join the Three Corners Alliance and benefit from it. Alas, it wasn't as if he was worthy of it in the first place. Their Land of Keys would have been significantly weaker than all of the others, and they were also not much better financially than any of them. He sipped his tea as he looked over some files, random reports about the village's finances and the number of new genin they had produced that year. Such reports were integral to the job of a Kage. Yamada was to check them before sending them forward to the daimyo of the Land of Keys in his quarterly report. As he was checking those files, a shinobi dropped from the ceiling of his office and took a knee, grabbing the Kage's attention almost immediately. "I guess it must be important since you are interrupting my tea time," Yamada muttered as he gave the masked Umbu a cold gaze. "Yes, sir. We have reports that the red dot has been spotted heading towards and entering the Shura clan's compound." The Umbu wasted no time in giving his report. The silence in the room following his report was so deafening that one couldn't even hear the sound of the waves outside crashing into the coast. The red dot. Well, why would? Yamada lost his composure at that moment. After all, Ken was a figure that could single-handedly wipe out the entire Land of Keys within the day. Yamada was well and truly stumped. What could he want from such a remote clan? Is he perhaps interested in their bloodline? But it is quite useless since it is uncontrollable. "Yes, sir. Should we send a party to intercept and attempt to question his intentions?" The Umbu continued kneeling as he spoke out. His words seemed to grate Yamada's ears, however. "What? Do you want to die? If you're feeling suicidal, don't drag the village down with you. No, no one is to bother Ken. Include the Shura clan in that order, for as long as Ken is even rumored to be close to the compound, we aren't touching it with a 10-foot pole." Yamada didn't care at all about losing face. He didn't care if his neighbors would taunt him later about Ken being able to just waltz into his territory like it was his own house. At the end of the day, the Kage saw his approach as being the most pragmatic in that situation. Pragmatism was his ruling principle at the end of the day. The Land of Keys couldn't possibly have anything to offer to someone like Ken. And since getting positively involved with Ken was near impossible, Yamada didn't want to get involved with Ken at all. Now, whether or not Ken wanted something from them remained to be seen. Although doubtful, if he truly needs our help with anything, he will seek us out. Not like we could stop him from strolling into my office any time he so desires. And so Yamada decided to continue with his day normally, with the shinobi under him doing just as instructed and drawing a perimeter around the Shura clan. Meanwhile, in a residence of the Shura clan's compound, Ken was still sitting at the table with his biological family. The conversation seemed to flow more smoothly at that table from that point forward. Hiroshi had a lot of questions, which Ken answered with the same relaxed and friendly smile. The blind monster also finally came to know his parents' names. The biological mother was named Ryoko, and his father was named Toyama. They all bore the Shura family name, representing their clan. The parents were awfully quiet as the brothers spoke about their lives up to that point. That's so awesome. So you hunted down those swordsmen just like that? Of course, Ken provided a simplified version of his past. A lot of it was public information regardless, it was just that Hiroshi paid no mind to the shinobi world. In HHM, I guess you could say I had a lot to pay them back for. But I somewhat outsourced their deaths to my subordinates, just to add that bit of humiliation in there. To this day I keep their blades within the organization that I have built. Ken smiled as he briefly remembered the events of that day. He may not have found the type of enjoyment he wanted from his revenge, but taking out such a disgusting group of shinboi was still a nice memory for him. Ryoko and Toyama were both pretty much petrified, finally remembering the very infamous parts of the Red Dots legend. Of course, the thought that Ken would take revenge on them did cross their minds. But seeing as they were still alive, and Ken hadn't peeled the skin from their bones the moment they dared to attack him, gave them some hope. Ryoko, at the very least, wouldn't ever fight back against Ken. If he decides to kill me, then so be it. She knew her mistake, hell, she regretted it moments afterwards, but her husband had insisted that raising Ken would be too difficult. At the time, Ryoko was persuaded by his argument that caring for a blind, rampaging member of the Shura clan for a lifetime was an impossible task. It was only through bonding with Hiroshi that she recognized just how grave her mistake was. She realized that caring for a child was never a burden as long as one genuinely cared for it. As Toyama grew older, he too felt disappointment in his younger self. However, he was more stubborn than his wife and never fully admitted his fault, at least until his mistake was staring him right in the face. Regardless, Ken's story of revenge wasn't the only concerning aspect to the parents. There was also their son's reaction to it all. Hiroshi really seemed to be cut from the same cloth as Ken. He seemed more impressed and fascinated when hearing about the gruesome deaths of the 7 swordsmen of the mist. They were not killed in battle, they were tortured, broken both physically and mentally, and ultimately murdered in their lowest moments. Ken had likely left them with such deep mental scars that they were never going to make it to the Pure Lands. After all, any soul with attachments and regrets was forever going to be stuck in limbo. Ken's revenge had inadvertently doomed their afterlives as well. The Shura clan had deeply spiritual beliefs, and so did the clan that Ryoko originated from, which was why they were all the more horrified by what their son, Ken, had become. Although, they really didn't have the right to call him their son. Anyway, that's enough about my life. I am doing well for myself, I am a proud father of hundreds now, and the Brotherhood is thriving more than ever. Both Ryoko and Toyama felt their eyes almost pop out of their sockets when hearing that. At least until they remembered that Ken was considered a father figure for all recruits in his organization. Hiroshi really seemed to admire Ken a lot. And how couldn't he? A child that was dealt what was likely one of the shittiest hands in life turned everything around thanks to sheer talent, hard work, and determination. Of course, if one were to ask Ken directly, then he would contribute most of his success to his unmatched talent. His skills as an assassin had carried over, but it was thanks to the body that he was born into that he was able to use them from such a young age. Had he been a normal child, then he likely would have only started his life in the shinobi world at around 15 or 16, when his body would have matured more. He would have lost many opportunities, and he would have certainly not been able to rise as quickly. Now then, let me get to why I've decided to visit you all in the first place. Ken slowly leaned into his chair. Hiroshi's attention was completely fixated on him. His parents both nodded. Information and blood samples. We will do our best to help you with everything you need, Ken. Toyama spoke out, his gaze told of his inner turmoil, betraying his calm exterior facade. But Ken didn't really care. Instead, he smiled and started learning more about his clan and its current situation, as well as the circumstances of his birth. Chapter 180, Shura Clan, Invitation and Guests. The questions Ken asked were all pointed toward finding out more about the Shura clan situation at first. His father was thankfully able to answer all of them, and things were a lot better than Ken had expected. In essence, the Shura clan could indeed not control their emotions when transformed. They would lash out and attack each other. Ken immediately surmised that nature energy was going to their head and affecting their thought process, likely turning it into a more primal and less rational one. Still, the fact that they attacked each other led to the current situation, where to maintain the Shura clan status Ken's biological father had come to an agreement with the village. He, as the chief, was the only one within the village to not inherit the clan's bloodline. He was tasked with essentially overseeing them and representing them before the Kage of the Land of Keys. The regular members of the clan would get a few hours each day outside of their homes, after which they would all chain themselves using chains made of the strongest material they had available. Ryoko, his wife, was the one to help him in all matters. As an outsider who married into the clan, she was also pretty much exempt from being chained to the wall. She was tasked mostly with delivering food to all of the members whilst they were chained. Whenever someone went into a frenzy, she was also the one to throw a smoke bomb made out of special gas to knock them out. After all, the adult Shura clan members could break out of any chains whilst, in a frenzy, it was important for them to not be allowed to harm themselves or others around them. Hiroshi also helped his mother with that, covering one half of the village whilst she covered the other. It was not a perfect system. Sometimes the clan members would break out and be sedated outside instead. Some clan members were chained near windows, and they had poisonous darts near them, containing a powerful sedative that would knock out the rampaging Shura clan members before they did further damage. There were plenty of procedures in place to ensure that the residents of the Shura clan survived through their frenzies, and most of them were centered around Toyama, the clan head. Their clan was not a powerful one, however, so they were taxed rather heavily by the hidden village nearby. The Land of Keys was providing them with resources and protection at the end of the day. But the Shura clan didn't have the greatest financial situation. The only real export out of the village was wood, which was cheap and rather plentiful through other nearby villages. They were also not able to help the hidden village with raising any shinobi due to the nature of their bloodline limit. The only person within the clan able to control his transformation somewhat was Ken's brother, Hiroshi. But he only really gained control over his transformation in his later teenage years, missing the time frame for attending any academy. Hiroshi was only able to control his transformations thanks to gaining some understanding and mastery over nature energy. Even without a teacher, he was able to achieve quite a bit, which was impressive on its own. He was far from being called a sage, but he was at least able to stop the energy from rushing to his head. This at least allowed him to use his bloodline limit, which technically made him a shinobi, but he didn't have any formal training aside from his mother coaching him slightly. She used to be a genin, so it wasn't like she could help him all that much aside from helping him gain control over his chakra and the basic 3 ninjutsu that every academy taught. Well, the variations of the 3 that her village had taught her anyway. Hiroshi had already mastered them, which at least put him at the level of genin, which really didn't mean all that much considering the fact that children had that very same rank and only went on small missions like repairing fences and catching cats. His bloodline limit, the transformation, was also very different from Ken's. That was the case for the entire clan, of course. They didn't grow any scales, nor did they seem to be able to alter their body like Ken could. Their transformation did turn their bodies into biological weapons. Nature energy-propelled attacks were what they were mainly capable of, and their physical strength was monstrous. The next thing Ken did after learning more about the Shura clan's situation as well as their bloodline was to ask for some DNA samples. At first, his parents thought that he wanted blood, and were quite anxious when he brought it up, but Ken plucked a strand of hair from each so fast that they didn't even feel it. He stored the DNA within a scroll, much to Hiroshi's excitement. So that's a seal? He was quite ignorant when it came to matters related to the shinobi world. Though his not recognizing the red dots mask was already a good indicator of that. Yep, a basic storage seal, very useful in transportation. I always carry quite a few resources with me when traveling. Ken pulled out a few scrolls and took out some warm meals to show to his brother. The seals are space and time fuinjutsu. They are surprisingly not complex to be considered anything special, despite the fact that space-time ninjutsu is considered the most difficult out there. Ken sighed as he remembered the hoops and leaps he had to go through to turn the summoning jutsu into the main method of transportation for the Dark Brotherhood. Hiroshi seemed to be quite fascinated about it too, his eyes sparkling as he listened to his brother's explanation. It didn't really need to be said, but Hiroshi pretty much saw Ken as an older brother, not really a twin. There was a stark difference in world experience and maturity between them at the end of the day. Maybe it was the blood connection or his innocence, but Ken also took to caring about him quite quickly. A lot faster than it would have in the past, of course. At this point, the blind assassin saw Hiroshi the same way he saw Minato. A kind soul in a dark world. But the difference was that Hiroshi was actually sheltered from the world. It's hard to tell whether or not he'd be able to maintain his kindness and purity whilst partaking in this mad world as Minato did. But it's better that he doesn't participate in it at all. Well, I have most of what I came here for. Ken slowly allowed his senses to prod the room and search for the expressions of the people around him. How about you stay for dinner? The question came from none other than Hiroshi. Had it come from either Ryoko or Toyama, the blind monster would have refused it without a second thought. Hearing his brother's voice, he did stop to consider it for a second. I'm unlikely to return here anytime soon unless the DNA results turn out anything interesting. Might as well humor him for a few more minutes. Fine, it had been a while since I'd sat down at a table and eaten with others. Even after reaching his current level of strength, and his progress essentially plateauing slightly, he still kept training with just as much intensity. Still, the time of him growing stronger with each day that passed was already over. Now it seemed that he would have to increase his strength by honing his techniques further and learning new jutsu. This constant training meant that most of Ken's meals were usually quick snacks in the middle of training breaks. Ryoko's eyes widened and a smile quickly formed on her features. I'll start preparing the food right away. She immediately got up and went towards the kitchen, a rather decently sized one at that. She started preparing some local cuisine that Ken was not quite accustomed to. Ken and his brother continued to speak during that time, with Toyama sometimes chiming in. Thankfully he was not ignored nor scorned whilst chiming in, at the very least his own son was still willing to speak to him. Ken didn't have much interest, but that was to be expected. Trust was something that could hardly be squeezed out of Ken even by his loved ones. Abandoning him once was enough to break any possible trust. No matter how much they grew as people, the blind assassin didn't care. Second chances didn't come quite so cheaply. Meanwhile, in the forest in the distance, the Umbu finally returned with their Kage's orders. We are not to get close to the Shura clan or Ken for now. Secure the perimeter and do not allow anyone to get close. The silence among their group stretched for a moment before one of them seemed to become quite panicked. The captain immediately realized that, and his gaze instantly fixated on his subordinate. What the fuck did you do? Will. I let some friends pass earlier, like always. Figured the red dot already left since there's nothing interesting about this Shura clan. The Umbu captain blankly stared at his subordinate. He could feel a blood vessel pop in his eyes from how hard he stared. As the Umbu squad was arguing, Ken and his brother continued speaking openly, sharing stories and experiences. It was during his interactions with his brother that another knock at the door was heard. This time the sun had already set, and the person, or rather people outside seemed to be quite a bit more violent. Ken could feel their emotions rather easily. He felt his father silently stand up when hearing the knocking, and he also felt his mother and brother both flinch. Open the door, freeloading scum! The man at the door shouted, his fists still banging on the door. Toyama scowled when hearing that voice, a low growl escaping his throat as a hint of shame appeared in his eyes. To be shamed in front of both of my sons like this. These bastards. The clan head opened the door, his face morphing from a scowl into a friendly smile. You guys. So glad to see you. Shut your trap. The man barged into the house, pushing Toyama out of the way as the other two followed behind him. Ken felt the wind bend around their features, more specifically he felt their headbands. Shinobi, well they are chunin at best. The leader is likely a special / Tokubetsu Jonin Mon. This really is a nice place. Good to see all the village's donations are helping your freeloading butts. The leader of the pack seemed to scan the home with his eyes. Sir Iruma. We've already paid the tax for this week. What do you want from us? Despite his frustration, Toyama still managed to speak out. Ken smiled as he remembered how his parents greeted him at the door. It seemed that this was far from the first time this group of shinobi beat on their door and entered their home. Iruma, the special Jonin, or almost Jonin as Ken liked to call them, ignored the clan leader. His eyes scanned the house, eventually landing on the dinner table. Please do not bother my sons. Toyama's hands clenched, as he didn't quite like the look that Iruma had on his face. The almost jonin continued to ignore Toyama, however. He instead looked at unmasked Ken for a few seconds, before a shit-eating grin split on his face and his eyebrows raised a bit. What's with the scarecrow? Didn't know you had a second shitty son, haha. Iruma mocked Ken openly, his cronies behind him laughing along. What rude guests. Instead of scowling, a wide and large smile split apart face. Chapter 181, Brotherly Perspective, Infamy, and Terror. For as long as I can remember, my senses were always stronger than those of others. I kept this little secret to myself, as I thought that everyone could at first. My smell could pick up on more subtle scents, my ears could make out hushed conversations even through walls. And I could always feel an energy revolving around my aunts and uncles, and even my friends. This was especially true when they entered a frenzy. They always become beast-like in some sense or another. I can somewhat predict when a transformation is going to happen a few seconds before it does due to the energy around the person rushing into their body. This has always been helpful whenever I am helping my mother. Still, it took me many years to even slightly get the hang of that energy. No one else seemed to be able to feel or see it, but it really is everywhere around us in nature. Every tree, every animal, they all seem to be guaranteed to have it, though to a very small extent. It almost feels like this world is alive and breathing, like a human. I mean, it's a cool thought to have. What if I managed to befriend it one day? Heh. But my enhanced senses weren't really limited to just smell, sight, and energy. I was also always able to pick up on the mood of those around me, which is great because it helped me cheer people up whenever they were feeling down. Maybe it's because of these abilities that I always felt as if part of me, of this family, was missing. It was as if there was a constant hole in the wall in my room. One that mother and father both struggled hard to hide with paintings or posters. That hole was something I always tried to fill out on my own. Making friends my age, and speaking to people I felt were good. My parents had moments where they looked really sad, where they cried and tried to hide away from me. That never worked. I could hear them. No words were spoken between them, only my mother's tears being shed and my father consoling her while holding back his own tears. I always thought that they were sad because I did something wrong. I strived to always be a good boy for them. The crying and sadness eventually dwindled, before disappearing altogether. I was happy. Mother and father were happy. Well, as happy as could be. Some bad people came by regularly to collect a toll from Dad. They were really mean too. I tried fighting them once, but I lost badly to that leader, Iruma. He broke my arm, and father had to kneel before him and beg him to spare me. It was bad. My acting out put my dad in a really bad position with the Hidden Village in general. Since then I always hid in my room whenever they came by. At least a year passed since then. And after such a long time, I've heard mother crying, again. When I came downstairs, I also saw the cause of it. A man, taller than me and father, a bulky frame filled with muscle hidden underneath a thin coat. Long spiky hair flowed down to his lower back. His features were great too. A sharp jawline, and a slightly upturned nose. Many would call him conventionally attractive, but the upper half of his face was mostly covered by his bangs, so I couldn't see his eyes at all. Upon seeing him, my mind felt both a strange sense of familiarity and fear. His scent alone. It was unlike anything I had felt before. The smell of a beast. But he made mother cry, so I couldn't let it slide. I was prepared to fight him if needed, even though every nerve in my body was telling me to do the exact opposite. Thankfully no such thing ever happened. Despite smelling like a beast, he behaved as anything but one. He was my brother. The missing piece. I could feel it, behind that beast-like scent, the familiarity in his features. He looked somewhat like father. It felt as if he was older than me, but in reality, we were twins. Finding out about his story made me mad at my parents. How could they abandon him like that? Left him to fend for himself? Well, not even that. A baby couldn't fend for himself. I've seen how clumsy they are in the younger members of our clan. Essentially, they left my brother to die. But I can't bring myself to stay mad at my parents, feeling their sadness and hearing their cries. It all makes sense now. They've been suffering silently for a long time because of this. They are not the same bad people that would do that to a child anymore. I've seen them care for the young in our village. I've felt their love growing up. Because I know them, I can bring myself to forgive and forget. But I doubt Ken would. His emotions are impossible to read. But he seems warm to me. God. All those stories, blood-pumping adventures, and plots. It feels as if I am speaking to a character from a book. Everything was going great. He even agreed to remain for dinner. Mother's joy was palpable. I could almost see it radiating off of her as she skipped over to the kitchen. Dad was mostly silent, but I could feel his happiness as well. He's never been good at expressing his emotions though. Then those bad guys that harassed Dad had to come by and ruin the mood. Though, when they chose to pick on Ken of all people, I felt mad. Before that scent seeped out of Brother again, and that smile spread on his face. Iruma was something like a wall for me, one I had to break through and just couldn't. It made me want to get stronger, but I am still not confident that I'd be able to beat him. But, when put into perspective, he feels more like a bug in front of Brother. What rude guests. The unmasked blind assassin's voice rang out through the room. He was unimpressed. Petty people who clung to any sense of power and authority over others existed everywhere. Iruma was the textbook definition of that. Toyama's breath hitched immediately. For a split second, he felt fear. That was due to the humiliation and trauma that their guest had inflicted on him. He thought that his son had made a mistake and that now his entire family would pay for it. Of course, that thought only lasted a half-second, as he then eyed Ken's mask, which was currently face down on the table in their living room. Instead of us making a mistake, it may be more accurate to say that Iruma may have just doomed the hidden village he is so proud of working for. Ken's reputation, or rather infamy, was not anything to scoff at. It was said that his means were frightfully efficient, and his powers were beyond monstrous. An undying monster was what many knew him as. A general do not engage order had long since been passed down to all shinobi working for any hidden villages, no matter the size. This was especially true for the smaller lands around, those that didn't have the protection of Great Kage. After all, Ken was recorded and renowned for having almost dismantled a hidden village similar in strength to the one in the Land of Keys while only being around the age of 10 or 11 at most. Toyama's fears shifted due to that. Towards Ken he couldn't help but feel a bit of fear, but also a lot of respect. He realized at the very least that Ken was a lot more fearsome than Iruma could ever dream of becoming. As the father of the house was pondering on that, Iruma scowled and gave a short laugh to his stooges, who struggled to laugh with him. The wild smile on Ken's face seemed quite creepy to the two shinobi. Guests? What? Is this brat mentally damaged? Iruma continued laughing as he patted his own stomach. Oi, other brat. How about you tell your brother how things stand around here? Iruma addressed Hiroshi with quite a bit of authority. But the young teen didn't budge. Really, he didn't even feel scared at all. Just his brother's presence was enough for him to feel completely relaxed, which enabled him to just yawn at Iruma's demands. Huh. The kid has gotten more arrogant, it seems. Iruma's hand reached to his back pouch as he spoke. He seemed to be doing his best to act as menacingly as possible. I'll have to teach you a lesson, it seems. Maybe break the other arm? Or rather cut it off entirely. The special jonin smiled as he took out a kunai. When hearing that, Ken turned his head towards his twin, tilting it slightly. Hiroshi seemed to be able to feel his confusion, so he just smiled and started explaining while rubbing the back of his head. I don't like him, so I tried beating him up once. Didn't really work out. He ended up breaking my arm. Ken nodded upon hearing his brother's explanation. Iruma seemed confused for one moment, unsure where all the fear he had instilled in Hiroshi had gone. He also glanced over at Toyama, who for some reason wasn't doing anything to discipline his brats either. Ken's hand slowly reached over to the table, and he flipped the mask over. Iruma's confusion was quickly replaced by frustration at not being taken seriously. But before speaking again, he did take note of Ken's action. And his eyes did end up landing on that mask. Any frustration that could have been found in his eyes and his furrowed brows vanished instantly. His eyes widened, pupils expanding slightly as sheer terror gripped him. Even the genin behind him had a similar reaction. After all, any shinobi that existed knew about the red, or at the very least knew enough to know not to provoke his ire. "Brother, you lost to this man?" Ken's head turned back towards Iruma. The special jonin could feel his hair falling out of his scalp when he heard the word brother. Lord Ken, I will repent, and I will make sure nothing like this happens again. Please spare me." In an instant, he was kneeling on the ground, head smashed against the wooden floor whilst every muscle in his body trembled in fear. The two behind him were a little slower, but they did very much the same thing. "I don't remember asking any of you to kneel yet." Iruma could almost feel his neck being cut open just from the tone in the blind monster's voice. He was about to force his body to stand up, but as soon as he moved even slightly upwards, he felt a foot land right on the top of his head, pressing his face back into the floor gently. "But since you are all wild dogs anyway, might as well stay like that." Ken didn't apply much pressure yet, though he could have easily just killed the man in that instant. Hiroshi's eyes widened as well, not because of how Ken acted, but because of the speed at which he did. Hiroshi's eyesight was just as good as the rest of his senses, but he couldn't even track Ken's afterimage. Toyama also couldn't help but sweat. Ken really was an authoritative figure wherever he went, a leader and a man who demanded respect. He was not and could not be disrespected freely. It didn't matter if he was in his own home or not. As his biological father, the Shura clan head could not say the same. "I don't really remember your name, wannabe jonin. But I think you understand the situation you are in right now." Ken smiled widely, just as he had when first speaking out. But this time, with the added context of Ken's identity, the smile was a lot worse for Iruma, who was too scared to even soil himself. The blind swordsman could feel Iruma's terror, which fueled his smile even further. "Now then, what should I do with these guys?" Chapter 182, Training Partner, Sparring and Tool. Ken scratched his chin for a moment, pondering on the best course of action. He could just kill the cretin and his followers. Send their heads neatly packaged to their Katya leader through some of the umbu outside. But that was a bit wasteful, now wasn't it? I can at least use this situation to help Hiroshi and learn a bit more about this bloodline limit. So, while smiling, Ken came to a conclusion. "Hiroshi, it seems you were a bit afraid of this worm. So let's do it this way. The two of you will fight again." The blind monster's wild nature flared out a bit, his words and demeanor startling the people in the room once more. Ken then bent down, grabbed the wannabe jonin by the back of the neck, and picked him up like one would a stray cat. He then started walking outside leisurely. The two other shinobi followed suit, not daring to even look the other residents of the house in the eye. Hiroshi could only blink a few times before looking at his father. Toyama looked just as confused, but he nodded regardless. Ryoko, who had been in the kitchen and listening in, also looked concerned, but she followed them outside regardless. Ken dropped the paralyzed inferior Iruma in the dusty dirt outside. He then reached into his coat and took out his blade. He slowly drew a large circle around Iruma and urged Hiroshi to enter it as well. "Kick in." But Hiroshi doesn't have much formal training. Ryoko ran up to Ken, her concern visible in her features. She liked seeing Iruma suffer, it seemed, but was vehemently against Hiroshi fighting him. Well, her refusal did come off a lot meeker in front of Ken. The mother of the house could not quite bring herself to speak out too loudly in front of Ken. Shame and anguish still filled her mind every time she glanced at him. "It will be fine." Hiroshi is going to get formal training now. Ken then pointed at Iruma. He is that training. Iruma, who was still prostrating on the ground, immediately nodded about a dozen times in quick succession. It is my honor to help in the training of your brother Lord Ken. Like all people who clung to the little power they had and abused it, Iruma was quick to agree to anything Ken proposed if it meant extending his life for even another minute. After all, he was not stupid enough to think that Ken would let him live so easily. So he did his best to be as useful as possible to the blind monster. Speak only when spoken to. Ken turned his head towards Iruma briefly as he spoke, before turning back to his brother and urging him to enter the circle. Hiroshi nodded, stretching his shoulder as he looked around the arena/circle. The two genin were standing on the side, kneeling as they waited for orders that were never going to come. And Iruma was pretty much contemplating whether or not to try and fight back against Hiroshi at all. Hiroshi, use your bloodline limit from the start, don't hold anything back. The young man nodded, his eyes becoming a bit resolute as his muscles seemed to shift. His skin seemed to become gray in most areas, and his hands immediately became bigger, with strange bones jutting out of them. Ken could not feel the difference in color, of course, but he could feel the difference in aura. So this is it, huh? I guess it is somewhat similar to my imperfect sage mode, or scaled sage mode. Ken was constantly in sage mode at the end of the day. His transformation only happened when he allowed the nature energy within his body to outweigh the chakra, essentially destabilizing his perfect sage mode manually. Of course, Hiroshi's transformation was fundamentally different from Ken's. He didn't seem to take the features of a beast but rather shift into something rather difficult to describe. Iruma's eyes narrowed as he looked at Hiroshi. Despite his submissiveness, he was still a decently powerful shinobi. Hiroshi's inexperience was something that he had taken advantage of in the past. Start the battle. Ken waved his hand, and both combatants rushed forward. It seemed that Iruma was a bit faster than Hiroshi, as he was able to circle around to the young man's side and throw a well-aimed kunai towards his abdomen. Hiroshi seemed to panic. He immediately moved his hand to block it, the kunai embedding itself very slightly into his palm. The young Shura clan member groaned slightly before swinging his arm in a wide motion, forcing Iruma to jump backwards as a cloud of dust was raised. So he is physically strong at least. Ken nodded as he felt that. Hiroshi immediately dived into the smoke, relying on his enhanced senses much like another transforming monster nearby. His fist clenched into a punch, and more protrusions came out of his shoulder and upper arm as he did so. In an instant, a burst of natural energy mixed with chakra jutted out of those protrusions. Hiroshi was immediately propelled forward towards Iruma, through the smoke, his punch aiming to smash the special jonin to bits. But Iruma wasn't exactly going to fall for such a straightforward attack. Hiroshi may have had decent senses, but he had no way of hiding his presence within the smoke like Ken did. Wind release, gale palm. Iruma even met the punch head-on with the jutsus he had prepared beforehand. Hiroshi's eyes widened, startled slightly as he felt the resistance of the wind bursting from Iruma's palm. That slight panic caused the energy propelling him forward to stop for a second, which led to him being sent flying backwards, tumbling across the training ground. Iruma didn't follow up with another attack though, he merely looked at Ken for a few seconds. He had essentially won the spar intentionally in a non-lethal way. The very last thing he wanted to do was to seriously injure the brother of the infamous Red Dot right in front of him. Hiroshi got up, growling slightly and feeling a bit embarrassed. He was about to try and attack again, but he didn't even get the chance to raise his fist. Okay, enough for now. Ken's voice sounded out, and with a clap of his hand, all of the dust in the small arena was immediately blown away, and both fighters were forced to take a knee not to be blown away as well. Iruma's expression returned to that terrified look as he witnessed the blind assassin's monstrous strength. The parents and genin around were also quite scared, but they were thankfully behind Ken, so they all got away with just shielding their eyes from the dust. Hiroshi, your way of fighting is too straightforward. But I guess changing that instantly would be hard. Ken scratched his chin, finally getting a good grasp on his brother's strength. He was essentially better than Iruma in all physical aspects, aside from agility. But when using the propulsion of those engine-like protrusions, he was also faster than Iruma. But not overwhelmingly faster. The difference in experience was something that couldn't be overcome easily. Hiroshi, in your next match, try to use that propulsion of yours from your back more. It should give you a better boost in speed. Also, you need to lose that panic of yours. Wannabe Jonin, just keep doing what you've been doing. The fighters both nodded and they soon resumed the fight, much to the displeasure of Ken's parents. But there was really nothing they could do. They couldn't really stand up to Ken, and Hiroshi himself seemed to want to fight. The next bout went about the same. Hiroshi did manage to get the upper hand for a second or two, by boosting forwards from his back and only one protrusion from his elbow. While it was enough to break through the earth wall that Iruma had raised, it wasn't enough to keep going after that, and Iruma was able to push him back again with yet another burst of wind. Before the next fight could even start, a masked figure finally walked into the village. Ken turned his head towards him, which made the others around them notice him as well. He was none other than the Umbu captain of the squad currently watching over the village. Lord Ken. He immediately took to one knee, doing his best to bow his head down as much as he could. Please forgive us for this transgression. No squad was to be sent to the village today. Ken hummed, tilting his head slightly. I had felt you lot running around the village walls in desperation for a while now. I guess you finally built up the courage to face me, huh? Ken's tone was even, not mocking in any way, despite his harsh words. It was natural for the Umbu captain to need courage to face someone like Ken. The fact that he had stepped forward and did so was impressive in the first place. Why yes sir. But an apology is in order, as the shinobi of our village have misbehaved in front of you. Our hidden village will do anything to appease you. Iruma paled a bit when hearing that. He recognized the man's voice. He realized that he was likely going to get demoted to a genin or academy instructor after the stun he pulled. Hell, he would be lucky to escape with his life. If Ken didn't kill him, then the village could decide to do it to appear the red dot. He was still clinging to hope though. He hoped that clinging to Ken would help him survive the disaster he had brought upon himself. Unfortunately for him, Ken only saw him as a tool. And tools were always to be disposed of when they lost their usefulness. Ken nodded at the Umbu captain, before snapping his fingers. No one could react to it, the Umbu member could barely even follow Ken's movements. But the blind monster had essentially almost unscrewed Iruma's head off, from the mark on Iruma's pulverized cheek. It was likely done by a single slap. Gah! Two pained voices sounded from the other side as well. The two genin that had followed Iruma were on the ground, their legs shattered, their hands twisted unnaturally. Ryoko and Toyama looked at the scene with startled gazes. They knew the rumors, they knew everything. But seeing such brutality with their own two eyes was something else. Ryoko couldn't even stop herself from vomiting. Despite all the bad that those men had done to them, they were still human lives. Hiroshi himself vomited as well, tears welling up in his eyes at the brutal scene. I guess we are quite different after all. Ken whistled a bit, before turning his head back towards the Umbu captain, who was completely unfazed. Ken's strength shocked him, but it was to be expected. He was someone considered closest to the god of shinobi. Quite likely the strongest person in their generation. As for the death of Iruma and the crippling of his followers? Good riddance. The fools had caused enough trouble to the land of keys already. You'll do anything right? Ken's tone seemed almost diabolical in the eyes of everyone present. But the Umbu captain nodded resolutely regardless. The fact that he was alive was a good sign at the very least. From now on, you will send an Umbu member of at least the special Jonin level to spar with Hiroshi over here. He is my biological twin, you see? Ken's smile sent shivers down the Umbu's spine as he finally realized what compelled the infamous Red Dot to visit their land of keys. Also, send a message to your Kage. I shall be meeting him soon to discuss some arrangements. Ken then waved his hand, dismissing the Umbu. Your wish is my command, Lord. The Umbu quickly saluted Ken, bowing once more before vanishing. Ken then turned to his terrified family and gave them a friendly smile. Well then. I guess you three need a bit of time to recover from that. I will go and continue making dinner. Your appetite is bound to return after emptying your stomachs like that. Ken passed by Ryoko and Hiroshi, patting both of them on the shoulder. The two flinched when he did so, their fear truly was palpable. The only one who recovered for now was Toyama, who just nodded to Ken and went to comfort his wife and son. Ken could still smell the fear radiating off of him, but there was also some glee there. Seeing Iruma's mutilated body seemed to bring him some modicum of pleasure. Ken's smile vanished as he entered the house. He leisurely walked to the kitchen before picking up a knife and dicing some chicken breast. I guess I'll make some crispy chicken salad. Chapter 183, Intentions, Purity and Kage. Remember Hiroshi, you gotta become strong in order to protect yourself. Ken spoke out as he brought his chopsticks down, grabbed yet another piece of perfectly fried chicken and brought it to his mouth. His family sat at the table and ate quietly and in a somewhat restrained manner. Hiroshi only nodded with a rather scared expression on his face. Ken's earlier display did wonders in putting fear in their hearts. But that was very much Ken's intention. At the end of the day, that violence was his identity for the longest time. He needed his biological family to understand that. The type of man he was. But also the type of man he had become. He killed without blinking, not that he was able to. He killed without hesitation, and most importantly, he didn't let anyone who slighted him off easily. These very obvious implications did wonders in making his biological parents very uncomfortable. But at the same time, Ken also sent the clear message that he didn't wish to kill them. Because if he did, they'd already be dead. If he had sought out his biological family a few years back and saw them living happily like that after they left him for death, he likely would have killed them, just out of principle. But now, he was a man who cared for his family above all else, even an estranged family. The virtues instilled in him by the care of the actual family that looked after him had materialized fully throughout his journey. After all, he had been nothing but warm to his brother. And despite slighting him, his parents were still alive. Hell, Ken had even made food for them. But there was another reason why Ken needed his biological brother to see that gruesome scene. Hiroshi seemed to somewhat start idolizing Ken during their talks, especially so when Ken was able to overwhelm Iruma with just his reputation, rendering their previous oppressor a tail-wagging dog without even lifting a finger. But the blind monster needed Hiroshi to understand that he was not a man to be revered. Only those who walked a path stained in blood could ever claim to appreciate someone like Ken fully. And he needed Hiroshi to understand that. He needed his estranged parents to understand it as well. Those of pure nature and mind could never get too close to Ken without being tainted as well. The Dark Brotherhood was specifically handpicked. Children that had already lost their purity due to the war. This was a specific choice, to only house them, to give those future misguided and previously wronged lives a proper chance at a good life. But purity was the main reason why children were chosen. Even someone like Ume was far from pure. She may have liked acting childish and was childishly timid to some extent. But that girl had watched her father get slowly decapitated in front of her, and she had also been forced to watch her mother get defiled as well before she also met the same fate as her father. She only survived because she hid in a barrel for around 3 to 4 days. She was lucky to have been found by a monk who was burying the dead in the village. She was still too hungry to move, but the monk saved her life, feeding her and helping her leave that damned place. Even in arduous times, good people still struggled against the tides. They swam upstream a river of blood to do what was right. There was no benefit in helping a half-dead little girl, but good was still present in the world. That nameless monk was one such example among many. And Ume was also lucky enough to be sent to an orphanage, and to get picked up by Tasho, the first blade. After all, it was only the blood-stained hands of someone like Ken that could help build a good future for someone with so much trauma and such a rocky past. But Hiroshi didn't have any rocky past. he didn't have any bloody birth, and he didn't have any outstanding issues aside from some humiliation and fear against a person who had done him wrong. Hiroshi's hand trembled, the blind monster could feel it. His brother's fear. Hiroshi's chopsticks failed to grasp his food most times. Ken assumed that the message was sent out accordingly. Any reverence that the young Shura clan member would be tempered by terror from that point onwards. Well then, I guess there is not much else left to do here. Ken could feel just how uncomfortable his family was with him. He didn't feel particularly hurt, nor did he care all that much, but he had already collected all of the information required. He had even done his biological family a favor and had arranged for his brother to gain formal training from the Umbu of the Land of Keys. Lore brother. Thank you. Why, you know. For everything. Hiroshi still managed to blurt out a thank you, whilst his eyes were still fixated on the meal in front of him. You are welcome, Hiroshi. Ken slowly stood up, putting his mask back on, cracking his neck and slowly walking to the door. Surprisingly, Toyama also got up and started walking behind him without saying any words. He's at least polite enough to show me to the exit, huh? Out of all of his family members, the father of the house was the least disgusted by Ken's actions. He was also spared the most humiliation at Iruma's hands by Ken at the end of the day. To Toyama, Iruma deserved everything he had gotten and more. He was nothing more than scum. He still felt some fear towards Ken. Someone like the Red Dot was an unapproachable figure to someone as small as the Shura clan head. Despite being blood family, Toyama still didn't want to upset Ken in any way, so he even walked a bit outside with him before bowing his head. Lord Ken! Thank you for everything. Seriously, you have done us a great service. Toyama's voice was a lot less fearful or hesitant, he was straightforward and genuinely grateful. Ken nodded. You are welcome. I may never call you my father, but you are still my brother's father and the leader of this clan. Have more self-respect from now on. Till we meet again. The blind monster wasted no time and left the village, turning into a blur in front of his biological father as he vanished in the wind. He walked through the forest just outside of the compound whilst whistling a cheerful tune. He could feel the Umbu around him trembling in fear and keeping a good distance from him. Ken pondered for a moment what else to do in the Land of Keys. He had truly gotten everything he wanted from the Shura clan. There was little else he could do in that region. But he still wanted to meet with the Kage there. Yamada, was it? I think he was part of the Whirlpool-facing alliance formed back in the day. He was smart enough to back off before losing too much, unlike others. Thankfully, he wouldn't have to make too big of a detour to get there. As Ken could feel the Kage appearing right in front of him, alongside the Umbu captain that Ken had dismissed earlier. Yamada was wearing his cap, his chakra levels were also quite decent for the Kage of a smaller region. Really, it was his chakra levels that had saved Yamada from being targeted for a brutal assassination by Ken during the war against the Uzumaki. Lord Ken! It is my honor. Yamada wasted no time to go on one knee and slightly bowed his head. A very respectful greeting, one that allowed the Kage to still maintain his face. Yamada was by no means pathetic or weak to greet Ken in such a way. In his mind, he was merely acting respectfully as one would when meeting a king. After all, kings were only important because they held the power to end the people who prostrated before them. And Ken certainly wielded that power. Yamada, no need for that. The blind monster chose to take the cordial approach this time around, immediately walking forward and pulling the Kage to his feet, much to the surprise of everyone around them. Normally, one would have around a dozen blades pointed at their vitals by Umbu if they even so much as breathed close to a Kage in their own land, but Ken was too terrifying a figure for that to ever happen. I have heard about you. You have managed to build and maintain a rather beautiful piece of heaven in this land. Ken's friendly tone seemed to have taken Yamada aback greatly. He blinked a few times and nodded. Thank you, sir. My predecessors worked hard for this place. It would be a disservice to them if I failed to maintain and develop it further. Yamada, now straight as an arrow, returned Ken's smile and shook his hand. Inside his mind, the Kage was jumping around and panicking, but he was truly glad that Ken was not bearing resentment for the actions of those foolish shinobi. When getting the message that someone had approached Ken and the Shura clan, he immediately got a bad feeling and started making his way there to soothe things over. Thankfully Ken was a lot more agreeable than the rumors surrounding him. I had heard that you wished to speak to me, so I decided to come and greet you myself. Someone as esteemed as yourself shouldn't be bothered with coming to my humble office. In truth, the last thing Yamada wanted was for Ken to go into their village at first. He may have claimed that the Red Dot would seek them out if needed and that there was no need to worry, but if possible he wanted to have the weapon of mass destruction named Ken outside of his village, but now it seemed that it wouldn't be that big of a deal if the blind swordsman just went there for a stroll or two. As long as some Umbu looked at him from a distance and made sure no one dared to bother him. Oh, I doubt it is humble. But to get to the point, I wish to speak to you regarding the Shura clan situation and taxation. As your man might have informed you, this happens to be the clan that I originally came from. I may not be a member of it, but my brother is. Yamada nodded, having already been briefed on the situation by the Umbu captain behind him. The fact that Ken was originally from the Shura clan was beyond shocking to Yamada, but it was also exciting. After all, that meant that his hidden village now had the chance to collaborate with Ken. Of course, we will make sure that the Shura clan is treated more fairly from now on. We will also arrange proper teachers for your brother, as well as a good supply of appropriately skilled sparring partners. Yamada was also not one to mince words, at least not in front of people like Ken. He immediately went above and beyond to accommodate any requests Ken might have had. He even sent a letter to his secretary to prepare all of the paperwork necessary whilst he was away. It was only natural for the Shura clan's treatment to change now that Ken was involved. Thank you. Now then, the other matter I wish to speak to you about is a bit more of a personal one. Chapter 184, Special Request, Vacation and Right Track. Yamada sipped an aromatic cup of tea as he sat down in his office, with the leaders of his village's clans all around the table. Lord Kage, with all due respect, making such a deal with the Red Dot is unadvisable at best. One of the old men around the office spoke out. His shaky tone made it clear that he was no powerhouse. The only real power within that village was Yamada, the Kage. The rest were mostly fodder, with very few exceptions. But those decrepit old men still had political power and affluence, which was what allowed them to stand in Yamada's office in the first place. What exactly is unadvisable about my dealings with the Dark Brotherhood, pray tell? Yamada was not one to go back on his words regardless. He had already struck a deal with Ken, and it was disrespectful to back down at that point. Download app well. The noble clans funding our village, as well as the daimyo of all surrounding lands, made it very clear that deals with the Dark Brotherhood will have to go through them first. One of the other fossils mouthed off, his face twisting into a scowl. No one was utterly pleased with the rulings of the nobles, but they were the ones providing the funding, so the hidden villages, especially the small ones like the hidden village of the Land of Keys, couldn't help but bend the knee. What exactly was I supposed to do? Send a letter to the daimyo and ask the Red Dot to wait for 1 to 2 weeks the very least to receive a reply? All for some occasional fucking field trips? Yamada scoffed at the notion. He was unwilling to admit that he had done anything wrong in the situation. And yes, the very last deal that Ken had made with Yamada was to make arrangements for all of the Dark Brotherhood members to be allowed to enter the hidden village and essentially enjoy a day or weekend at the beach occasionally. The Kage of the Land of Keys agreed almost instantly and even went out of his way to secure the best accommodations for them after Ken brought it up. It may appear like a field trip. But what if they are instead looking to gather information on us? Or set up an informational network? One of the other elders present brought up a good point. At least it seemed like a good point before one decided to use more than 1 second to think about the issue. And what information would the Red Dot even want from us? What information would there be that he wouldn't already be able to attain by sifting through the burning ruins of our village after he decides to destroy it on a whim? Yamada had already thought things through. In the first place, the rule placed by the noble clans was only there to prevent other factions from aligning themselves with the Dark Brotherhood. Such small deals were unlikely to cause much of an issue in the long run. Yamada, as well as the noble clans, were not delusional enough to think that working together with Ken on a small task in exchange for some supplies would make them allies. It was a business transaction, one that had ended very favorably for their hidden village. By now, it was no secret that Ken's pockets, and by extension the Three-Corner Alliance's pockets, ran quite deep. Especially since it had been later discovered by some of the nobles snooping around that the Dark Brotherhood had dealings with the Merchants Guild. They were able to easily take loans necessary to build trade routes in full. Between the members of the alliance, they really had everything they needed to be self-sufficient. Now it was just a matter of how long could the noble clans put up with the lack of control before trying something stupid. But Yamada had no reason to get himself involved with all of their politics. A small transaction was just a way for his village to get a much-needed stream of funding and essential supplies. If anything, Ken having connections to the Merchants Guild only made the notion that the Dark Brotherhood was looking to build an informational network in their land of keys ludicrous. The Merchants Guild was the only information network that a man like Ken could ever need. In Yamada's eyes, it was like a gigantic but essential tumor on the elemental nations. It was impossible to get rid of, as the wealthy merchants within the association could cause nations to prosper at the flick of their wrists. The most affluent ones were able to enrich the economies of entire cities just by starting up their shops in the area. But, because of how deeply intertwined they were with the flow of cash, vital information was impossible to hide from them. Ken being interconnected with such a group couldn't help but put a smile on Yamada's face. The Kage's deal with Ken was not for a one-off vacation at the end of the day. It was for a permanent holiday location within their hidden village by the seaside. It wasn't exactly ownership of the land, as it was impossible for Ken to legally own any land in any of the nearby territories due to how butthurt the nobles were, but the land was being rented to the Dark Brotherhood through a subsidiary that Yamada himself oversaw. Such a secure extra stream of cash and resources was a small breath of fresh air for the strained budget that the noble families almost always asked them to make do with. Well, having foreign assassins roaming the streets was somewhat stressful. But Ken had made the rule that they would all blend in as civilians, to avoid any panic or information about their presence from spreading. Even now, Yamada was the only man aware that Ken and his children were all at the beach, enjoying the sun and the waves. At the private residence that Yamada had prepared, the children were already busy running along the sand, singing along, and making castles of wet sand. Even the older ones were playing in much the same way. They were just making bigger castles and actual life-sized sand samurai. We shall take their lands from them. For we may have lost our honor in the arena, but we shall never lose in the field of war. Morita's voice boomed as he stood unmasked on the wall of the small house-sized castle that he had built in the sand. In front of him was a very similar castle, only a few dozen meters away. Its walls were not as detailed, but it seemed to have more sand samurai. And on top of that castle stood a one-legged figure, also giving a motivational speech to his army. Heed not their words of provocation. For the losers can only revel in the moment to forget the past. I shall lead you, my men, to glory. Now and forever, for the lobster crown. Ken sipped a cocktail as he stood off to the side, his students doing their best to control the sand soldiers to mash against each other awkwardly, with many of the children on either side trying to control one samurai with chakra strings. It was a good exercise. Ken found it odd that many of his children had turned their vacation into an odd training session though. Teacher, thanks for also letting me join. Yu was constantly sitting by Ken's side in her swimsuit, thanking him occasionally and trying to get his attention. She had been behaving better after a period of boring punishment, but Ken was not done with her punishment yet. It was hard to tell if she was behaving better to escape the punishment or if she had actually understood her wrongdoings. Hoo-ha. Of course, no matter how much she had grown, Ken still saw her as nothing more than a kid. An ungrateful kid at that. Ken had already set a rule internally for himself, to only renounce her punishment and forgive her, after she went to sincerely apologize to Mifian for her words. The old general may have tried to not take her hurtful words to heart, and likely couldn't bring himself to resent her in any way, but Ken was not going to let her behavior pass. Of course, you was going to receive 0 hints as to what she needed to do to escape her punishment. It would be too easy otherwise, too insincere. Damn. It would have been nice if Tasha was here in person as well. To the side, Akira was just digging a hole. A large hole. He had supplied the children with the sand to build their armies and castles, but his intentions with that hole were really impossible to guess. Well, Ken knew that there was no such thing as thought put behind the third blade's actions. Tasha still had to oversee matters back home. Bounty hunting operations are still ongoing at the end of the day. And Saburo is too busy with his experiments lately. He's doing some tasks for me too, so he's got no time to waste on relaxing. Ken patted Akira on the back, before pushing him back towards the hole to keep digging. The other 2 blades were not with them on vacation. Both of them were too busy, and the compound needed someone to oversee it even in the absence of the children. And Saburo didn't care about a vacation anyway. To him, his lab was his job, his vacation, and his rest. As long as he could work unperturbed, he was the happiest and most fulfilled man within the Brotherhood. Well, second most fulfilled man anyway. Ken sighed as he felt the children playing around the beach. His only regret was that he couldn't grow eyes to see it all. But not having eyes also allowed him to appreciate the scene in his mind even more. He could feel all of the stress being washed off of the children, he could feel the joy bubbling up within them. It was euphoric. Even the newer recruits were slowly coming out of their shell to enjoy the cheerful atmosphere. They were all unfortunate children, gathered together from different walks of life and brought into that big family. At first, it was all scary to them, the prospect of becoming assassins. Many wanted to give it a try at least. They were all presented with the option of leaving it regardless, but the reality of the Brotherhood drew them in to stay. The aspect of a second family was enticing, but in application, it was even more so. A huge community of like-minded individuals, all focused on living their best lives. The training and assassination skills they were receiving felt more like a backdrop to that for many of the children. Ken also realized that the newer generations of recruits were bound to be less hard-focused on training. The times of war were also over, so there was less of a drive for them to train and get stronger in general. But the blind swordsman still hoped that the hard-working attitude of the first batch of recruits would eventually rub off on all of the new ones as well. Now was not a time for training anyway. Now Ken wanted the children to only focus on having fun. And focus on fun they would. After that, they could focus on anything else they want to learn. It was time for the Brotherhood to start its agricultural division anyway. Children were bound to have more options if slitting throats was not something they wished to do in the long run. Assassination and fighting skills were still a requirement to remain within the Brotherhood, which was a strict rule that would remain regardless of how things developed. It was a bit harsh, but it was necessary for Ken's vision. No weak link could be allowed to exist within the Brotherhood, at least not for now. Regardless, everything was already set in motion. Black Zetsu was off hiding and doing his best to follow Madara's plans whilst avoiding any contact with Ken or people associated with him. The leader of the cult of Jashin was still looking into ways of seamlessly coming in contact with Ken. The daimyo and many noble clans around were doing their best to cope with the fact that a faction had risen within their midst, which challenged their influence greatly. That situation remained a boiling pot for now, but it wasn't anything too urgent. After all, no power could contend with the Three Corners Alliance on the battlefield for now. And most importantly, the elemental nations now knew better than to slight Ken or the Dark Brotherhood. Everything seems on the right track for now. I look forward to the next few years. Chapter 185, Mountain Shade, Developments and Letters. There was a local legend currently spreading among the common folk to the furthest corners of the Land of Iron. One that deep within the mountains of the Iron Peaks, further inland than any regular man would have dared to walk, there stood a thriving community. A peaceful village to outsiders, closely guarded and always flourishing. A place where young men and women started living their lives after the war. Many of those youngsters took on professions like trading, making pottery, ironworking, carpeting, etc. The village was a vast expanse of land, hidden within the shadow of the Iron Mountain, and entirely covered by a set of thick walls that went as far as the eye could see. Masked individuals constantly guarded the gates. There was always an eye on any visitors that entered that large village. Though hard to reach even with the paved road leading to it, many still chose to make that journey. It was all due to the massive trade center that merchants from all over the world now frequented. The trade center had sprouted right in the middle of the village. All shops were manned by residents of the village, young men and women, and they were touted to barter shamelessly like old crooks with all of the visiting merchants. Outsiders were allowed to sell and buy goods, but setting up shop was prohibited to them. Inns and rest stops were built, but no one was allowed to stay there for more than 2 weeks. Many of the nearby villages traveled there to buy longer-lasting essentials, medicine, and solid tools. They all knew stories of the place, and they heard the rumors. That mountain village was said to treat peasants the best. They would always make things affordable for the common man or woman who walked into their fold. Sometimes, shinobi tried to infiltrate the village, to place spies on the inside at the behest of the ruling noble clans. But those attempts were always shut down by the locals. Each stall owner, everyone from the street sweepers to the farmers. They were said to be as lethal as any shinobi from the established hidden villages in the elemental nations. Nothing could escape their eyes. And every wrong movement would cause the blade guards to move out. Of course, all enemies were dealt with accordingly. The blade guards, as they were called, seemed to be a specialized group made to capture and interrogate any intruders. They were led by the fifth blade, another masked fellow who carried a strange blade with him. His unique mask with 5 slash-like marks was what made him stand out to the common folk. The blades themselves were touted to be the leaders of the village by the common folk. They were the ones making the rules and ensuring they were followed. Despite its apparent strength, both military and economic, the village was by no means old or established. It was, in fact, quite new. Locals referred to it as the village hidden in the mountain shade. It was a name that had already spread out through the rest of the elemental nations as well. What most commoners had no way of knowing was that the hidden village they were traveling to and bartering with was in fact the legendary Dark Brotherhood. An organization housing the most prolific and skilled assassins/bounty hunters that the world had ever known. From the blades to the numbered, they were all considered to be skilled and deadly. But the biggest monster among them was still none other than the Red Dot himself, the head of the snake, as some would say. The foundations of the Dark Brotherhood had been laid down already. The children had already mastered Ken's assassination arts to some degree and were allowed to each follow their own passion, no matter how productive they were to the sprouting village. More and more unfortunate orphans came in each year to join their now massive family, and each time their backgrounds were checked thoroughly by both Tasho personally and with the help of the Merchants Guild. Of course, not all children were cut out for life in the Brotherhood. Dozens had already dropped out. It was a bit harrowing for Ken to have to send back children who had already formed bonds with those within the Brotherhood, but he knew he had to do it. After all, an organization was only as strong as its weakest link. A lot of tears were shed by the children. Departures were in the dozens every year, but those that remained were all the more motivated to train and not give up. It left the blind monster with a rather sour feeling on his tongue, but it couldn't be helped. The training of the Brotherhood had already become more streamlined and lenient among the younger generations. They could not afford any more slack. Each recruit needed to at least be at the level of a Chunin before graduating from their training and being able to specialize outward in different fields. The majority of the first and second generations had already far surpassed that long before reaching the age of 14 to 15. It wasn't like it was a far-out goal. After all, the Brotherhood provided all recruits with countless resources and hidden techniques that only the top of the greatest hidden villages would have had access to under normal circumstances. All Ken asked was for them to take their training seriously. That was the one requirement to be able to join their family, and it was something that the blind monster had made clear from the start. Many arguments had arisen due to Ken deciding to stick to that core tenet of the Brotherhood, but it couldn't be helped. A civilization could only move as quickly as its slowest person in order to progress, and Ken could not afford any slow growth during such a crucial time. Aside from those squabbles, The Brotherhood's expansion had gone very steadily, the organization had boomed in both numbers and strength. Morita had gone ahead to become the 5th blade, a very deserving promotion in Ken's eyes. He now wielded the Kiba, the twin blades that conducted lightning better than any others in the elemental nations. His division was something that Morita himself had thought up. A torture and interrogation sector that was focused on gathering intel from prisoners and caught spies. After all, someone had to do the dirty work. And Morita was unbothered by the prospect of getting his hands dirty. It had been Saburo's work in the beginning, but Ken wanted the strawman to fully focus on scientific advancements, which was why duties were now split accordingly. Many of the previous numbered had started different sectors within the Brotherhood, but only the combat and military-oriented sectors became blades. The others were colloquially called agriculture head, construction head, and so on. At that point, Ken was more than proud to say that the Dark Brotherhood had truly become self-sustaining. The outside world had seen plenty of changes during those years though. 6 years. Who would have thought that so much could change in 6 years? Ken sighed as his calloused hands traced the ripped pieces of paper on his desk. The Three Corners Alliance, once a beacon of power, was now in the middle of a rather nasty internal conflict. The relations between the Cloud, the Uzumaki, and the Leaf had always been bad. But they had only gotten worse over the years. And how couldn't they? No matter how much Ken and Mifune insisted that things were to be done equally, each hidden village always tried to gain more than the others. It was seemingly in their nature to always want to be one step ahead when compared to even their allies. Of course, Ken was well aware that the hidden villages were all likely trying to mend things with and follow the orders of the nobility in each of their respective countries. There was no other reason why they'd act in such a way. The alliance was already considered self-sustaining as well. But the villages wanted more than to just scrape by, they wanted to seemingly always flourish. The fact that Ken seemed to be able to make the Dark Brotherhood grow exponentially did seem to spur them on too. Jealousy was still present even among friends. Still, things weren't quite so bad just yet. Had it not been for Ken and the Land of Iron still being present to soothe things over, a war would have likely already broken out between the other factions. But war was nothing more than just yet another political game at the end of the day. Things were strained but still kept straight, and everything was moving on within expectations. The biggest changes to the world were certainly the monumental rise of the Green Forest Union. That random group of bandits that Ken didn't care enough to look into previously was now becoming an actual threat to the elemental nations. But it was not a threat to the Dark Brotherhood specifically, so Ken had no reason to care about it for now. What he cared more about was the ripped-up papers on his desk. Or rather the writing on those papers. The Akatsuki was attacked. Its leaders are presumed dead. Possible culprit, Hanzo the Salamander. It was a note by none other than Akira, the third blade, or at least one of the many scouts and spies underneath him. He was now in charge of the espionage department, and he had spread a rather decent network in all surrounding lands. The Merchants Guild was nice to have as an ally, but it was important for Ken to not have to depend on others for such matters. Ken sighed, his fist clenching a bit as he then reached for the other letter on his desk. This one was a bit more jovial than the last. It was a wedding invitation. It put a smile on Ken's face, but that smile didn't last too long, as he still had pressing issues to deal with. Festivities will have to wait for now. I have to make a trip to the Land of Rain, catch up with some old friends. Chapter 186, Progress, Encounters in Red Cloud. Ken sighed as he dashed from tree to tree in the forest. Every branch he stepped on, every leaf he used as a foothold, they all remained unmoving as he passed them by. The blind monster also had the option of traveling through the skies, but it was harder to stay hidden up there, not like he could control the clouds constantly covering himself, it was rather the opposite, the flap of his wings would normally disperse clouds more than anything. After all, the stealth techniques that he had developed and learned in his past life didn't quite help with flying. He was still in the process of creating a method of flight and jutsu that could help conceal him whilst in the air, but that was still a work in progress. When it came to strength, Ken had developed and honed his skills even further. Physically speaking, he had not grown too much more, just his body reaching adulthood gave him a boost in strength. Now, whilst in his base form, he could match the Raikage physically even if he used the lightning chakra mode. And he could match the black lighting chakra mode whilst in his scaled sage mode. But what had progressed the most for Ken was certainly his jutsu arsenal as well as Fuinjutsu in general. He had mastered quite a few nature transformations and even found out that his chakra natures had shifted over the years. In the past, he had wind and lightning, but now he seemed to be compatible with all of them, including the rarer ones, like Yin and Yang. This allowed him to spec out and learn a lot during those years, especially learning and even developing jutsu of numerous nature transformations. But what improved most was certainly his Jinjutsu. After all, he had been a master of quite a few jutsu in the past, and he was certainly a master of taijutsu and kenjutsu. But what was the most lacking in his arsenal was Jinjutsu, and more specifically sensory deprivation illusions, activated by either scent, sound, or a visual cue. Saburo was there to help Ken develop his illusionary skills to the fullest extent, as it came hand in hand with his research. After Ken's direct bloodline turned out to be a dud, they weren't really able to do much. The Shura clan certainly housed the blind monster's biological family, that much was undeniable, but they didn't seem to share the same genetics as him. The mother's side was what made the difference in his genetic makeup. His father and brother were both normal. A rather unknown clan thought to be already extinct, the Kagaya clan. Their bloodline limit had a lot to do with control over their bones, or so the eroded history books that the Merchant Association found told them. Ken also shared that bone control ability to some extent. He was able to control his bones but not exactly turn them into weapons like they were touted to be able to do. He could alter the structure of his bones, and change his height and weight at will. But those were changes that he made to his entire body as well. In a sense, every aspect of Ken's body was already a weapon, so turning his spine into a blade or a whip to use just seemed counterintuitive, not that it was something he'd even attempt in the first place. Overall, there was too little knowledge of the Kagaya family for any further progress to be made on that, so Ken had to focus on other avenues to improve his strength. Ken had come a long way. Whilst not as talented in Jinjutsu as he was in other aspects, he had still progressed to the point where many could call him a master of it. Overall, Ken could only now confidently say that he was the strongest being alive. Stronger than the tailed beasts, stronger than the great Kage. He had likely reached the level of the former god of shinobi already, if not surpassed it. But it was hard to gauge how strong Senju Hashirama was from just stories. He was the man who had treated all tailed beasts as pets at the end of the day. The greatest issue that Ken found in his development was the lack of adversity. The times of peace were nice, but even if the whole world was to fight him, he'd likely still be able to win. Injuries would heal and scar over, and limbs could regrow. There was nothing fast and strong enough to kill him for good. He had no way to hone his skills in great peril like at the beginning of his life, back when regrowing limbs was actually somewhat stamina draining, or when the 7 swordsmen of the mist were actually a threat to him. He was somewhat stuck now. Being the strongest was a curse that prevented him from growing further. Jinjutsu was really his last resort for monumental growth. Now all he had was slow progress in all other aspects of his skill set. But he was still the strongest by a long shot. And his reputation also reflected that. His infamy had only festered and spread over the years. His defeat of the Raikage had further cemented him as the strongest. The fact that Hiruzen the Hokage was unwilling to face him also made others think so. The god of bounty hunters was what some of the bingo books called Ken now. So where did Hanzo gain the boldness to actually act out against the Akatsuki? An organization backed by me? It was jarring. The blind assassin simply couldn't wrap his head around what stroke of madness drove Hanzo the Salamander to make such a choice. Were the noble clans trying to diminish his influence over the rest of the lands not involved in the Three Corners Alliance? They might have gained wind of the slight cracks forming in the Alliance's foundations, but Ken doubted they'd have the guts to make a move so quickly. Regardless, the blind monster would gain all of the answers he needed from Hanzo himself. But the first place Ken visited was the Akatsuki compound. The small village created by the orphans within the Land of Rain, all of them located within a ravine, covered on all sides by large natural rock formations. When Ken arrived in its vicinity, he couldn't help but sigh. The entire compound was destroyed. It was most likely a man-made avalanche of rocks from all sides. The entire village was buried, and all of its residents were crushed, killed in their sleep by the look of it. They've barely left any tracks around this place. But I can tell this was not natural. These cliffs were as solid as those that the Cloud Village is perched upon. The only bodies that were missing were of the 3 leaders of the Akatsuki: Nagato, Yahiko, and Konan. The 3 that had done their best to start the organization in the first place. The only possible explanation was that they were away during the avalanche. Nagato's eyes were special, he seemed quite strong even by my standards. I doubt he would have let this happen. What a shame. So many lives are being thrown away even during peaceful times. Ken couldn't help but whisper in the wind as he stood at the very edge of that ruined cliff. May your spirits at least find rest in the Pure Lands. I will make sure that whoever did this pays dearly for it. Ken slowly turned away with that small prayer and promise. He had not bonded with the members of the Akatsuki, but he knew. He knew that, if things were even a little bit different, they could have been members of the Dark Brotherhood instead. The only reason Nagato didn't wish to join them fully was because he and the Akatsuki were dedicated to making the Land of Rain better from the inside. They didn't wish to join an outside organization like the Dark Brotherhood. That was their wish. To make things better for the common man and child in their homeland. Politics be damned, Hanzo is going to have to answer for what has happened here. And so, Ken turned into a blur and vanished in the wind. This time he was headed for Amigakure, the village hidden in the rain. The journey only took a few moments, as the assassin used his full speed to reach the hidden village and pass through its gates without being detected. Hanzo's office was very much the same as Ken remembered it, a metallic building reminiscent of a skyscraper in his old world, with a view that overlooked the entire village. Ken couldn't quite admire the view, but he wasn't there to admire anything at all. If anything, depending on how his conversation with the salamander went, the entire village could end up being wiped from the maps of the elemental nations. Chapter 187, Salamander, Confusion and Truth. Ken stepped into Hanzo's office and sat down on the Kage's chair whilst waiting with his legs crossed. With a flick of his finger, all of the umbu that had been present in the room fell unconscious, all tangled up in strings, almost as if they had been captured by a spider to be consumed at a later date. The Amigakure village was uncharacteristically quiet as the blind monster's senses washed over it. It was as if they were preparing for war, which was quite confusing. Why would the atmosphere be this tense after half a decade of peace? Why has the Merchants Guild or the Spy Network not informed me of this? Unless it's a new development. The Amigakure's position had always been bad. The Land of Rain was turned into a battlefield by all surrounding nations, forced to get plunged into wars over and over again, wars that they had no stake in. The era of the Salamander came, one of the strongest shinobi in their generation. He swore to protect the Land of Rain, and protect it he did. He fought hard and repelled countless powerful shinobi all on his own, gaining a reputation and infamy almost on par with the current god of shinobi, Hiruzen Sarutobi. But he was only one man. His land was still torn apart by war, and there was little he could do about it. The period of peace must have been good for him as well, which really only confused Ken further. Why would he go and get rid of the Akatsuki? Hanzo was always worried about them, sure. They were representative of the presence of a foreign force in his land. The Salamander had somewhat seen them as an extension of the Dark Brotherhood, despite them not being part of it. But why would he decide to attack them now? What was the point? Hanzo was not an idiot. He should have known that no matter how much he had erased his tracks, Ken would tie the matter to him or would at least question him about it. There was no lying in front of the blind assassin. Even the slightest change in blood pressure was something that Ken could sense. He had become somewhat of a lie detector over the years. It did wonders during interrogations and political talks, but it was an otherwise minor side effect of his overall monstrous constitution. Hanzo was already aware of Ken's eyes and how far they saw. So why would he try something against the Akatsuki? Did he think I grew mellow over the years or something? It was true that with the peaceful era upon them, Ken had been less and less active in the field. Some would start thinking that he had gotten rusty, but it wasn't like the blind assassin was past his prime. In fact, by human standards, it was rather the opposite. He had lost track over the years, but he was somewhere around 21 or 22 years old, which meant that his best years were far from over. Of course, human standards were not exactly the best thing to take into account when considering Ken. But they were something to be considered when thinking of Hanzo. Maybe Ken had failed to take into account how old age would affect the human mind? That could also be the answer. After all, older humans were sometimes predisposed to going senile or developing dementia. Regardless, the salamander would have to explain himself. Ken felt Hanzo reach the door to his office. He turned around in the chair, facing the window, and heaved a silent sigh. Hanzo entered the office none the wiser of what was transpiring. It took him all but 1 second to realize that something was wrong, especially when he saw his guards strung up for display. Hanzo. The salamander also recognized the voice almost immediately, and he felt the hairs on his back tingle for a moment, his spine trembling with unease. Sit down. Despite being in his own office, Hanzo didn't at all feel like he was at home. Instead, he sat down in the chair in front of his desk as instructed. He gulped a bit, likely already guessing what Ken's visit was about. I believe introductions aren't needed here. You should know why I'm here. Ken turned around in the Kage's chair, placing his feet up on the desk as he tilted his head towards the salamander. My people. I had nothing to do with the demise of the Akatsuki. Hanzo gritted his teeth as he spoke. It was hard to gauge if he was lying or not though, as his entire being was rather irregular due to the unease and fear that came with standing in front of Ken. But Ken didn't notice any improvements or deterioration in his blood pressure or heartbeat as he spoke. It was possible that the salamander was telling the truth. And why should I believe you? The Akatsuki were stationed in your land, under your watch. Now they are all mostly dead, with the leaders missing. Ken slowly stood up on the desk, stepping off of it gracefully as he started to circle Hanzo with light steps. The salamander trembled slightly before grasping at Ken's coat. Under normal circumstances, Ken would have cut off that hand before it reached his coat, but he didn't feel any bad intentions from Hanzo, so he let it happen. He didn't react much when Hanzo grabbed his hand and tapped on it in a specific manner. The blind assassin then nodded, his hands moving quickly as he threw out 4 kunai with paper tags around the 2 of them. He then made a simple hand sign. And he allowed his chakra to fill in the gaps of that formation. There you go, a soundproofing formation. Speak your mind now. The salamander breathed a sigh of relief when hearing that. They don't know how much I know. But this entire office is being watched. Hanzo slowly stood up and looked out the window, before closing the curtains. For a moment, the powerful village leader looked almost paranoid. The nobles, all of the ones in this land and the surrounding ones somehow found out about the Akatsuki's connection to you. They were dead set on wiping them out. Hanzo leaned onto his desk as he placed his chain and sickle on it. Ken couldn't help but notice the smell of blood coming from that weapon. They tried hiring our village first, but I refused. The last thing our land needed was to become the starting point for another war. Hanzo scowled underneath his gas mask as he felt the unfairness of the situation all over again just by remembering it briefly. Yet, it seems that they were still all murdered? If not by you, then by mercenaries dressed to look like your forces. Ken judged all of the salamander's responses. He was either a very controlled man, able to work under an ungodly amount of pressure, or he was telling the truth. I was going to inform you, but I had no time to reach you before they sent that other group to do it. I only had the time to summon the leaders of the Akatsuki to an undisclosed location. That was all that I could do. Hanzo slowly reached into his back pouch and pulled out a scroll, a small map. He handed it over to Ken, who took it and opened it in that same instant. His hand ran over that parchment, recognizing the location on the map by some landmarks nearby, before placing the scroll in his coat. As for the men who did it, they weren't just mercenaries, some were truly shinobi from my village. I do not know who I can trust anymore in this village. The walls have ears, and they seem to always go to whoever the highest bidder is. Hanzo's teeth seemed to clench as he spoke. It was pretty clear to Ken that he was having a hard time. He was stuck between 3 different hard places, and they were all leading to possibly catastrophic situations for him and his people. Ken couldn't even blame him for being stressed out. So, he continued to let the old salamander rant. I already intercepted and slayed the ones responsible for the massacre. A group of around 300, they were well prepared, but they were just grunts. The strongest among them were top-level jonin only. One was dressed like me though. They all died with their skin melted off in clouds of poison. I made sure of it. Ken huffed a bit when hearing that, feeling that the situation was starting to look more and more like a pain in the ass. 300, huh? That's essentially a war party, isn't it? It felt odd to speak about such major forces in an era of peace. It seemed that there was always something brewing in the background looking to take a shit on whatever progress Ken made towards his goal. Indeed. It brought me back to the old days. But not in a good way. Hanzo eventually walked around his desk and sat down in his own chair, before reaching for a few other scrolls in his desk. I'm sure you've realized by now, but something big is happening. I do not know what, or why. But I expect the next few decades to not be as peaceful as you want them. Hanzo sighed once more, before rubbing his forehead in frustration. I guess I will have to look into this further on my own too. Thank you for the information, and for your cooperation. Keep the kunai and tags. Ken then reached into his pouch and threw a scroll towards Hanzo, who caught it with a confused look on his face. This soundproofing formation is a basic technique of Fuinjutsu, but it will let you know if someone is trying to listen in. Learn it, it will serve you well. With that, Ken disappeared from the office, heading straight for the location that Hanzo had confirmed. Meanwhile, the salamander just sighed, collected the 4 kunai and started studying the scroll that Ken had left him. He didn't bother untangling his guards from Ken's strings, he figured they'd manage after waking up. As for the gathering of nobles that was behind everything? Well, they were currently holding a meeting of their own, deciding on future moves they could take. They only had 2 goals in mind. Diminish the influence of the Dark Brotherhood and break apart the Three Corners Alliance. Chapter 188, Mission, Struggle and Pain. The past 3 days had been truly nightmarish for the 3 leaders of the Akatsuki. Nagato and Yahiko were only really holding themselves together thanks to Conan still being there for them. All was going well until they received a message with a secret mission from Hanzo the Salamander. The leader of the Amigakure asked them to go to a village on the very outskirts of the Land of Rain. Their mission was to take down a segment of the Green Forest Union that had started forming in that region. It specifically requested that the 3 of them go out along with any of their subordinates they deemed fit. They had gathered a group of 10 men and women to go out on that mission, with them included. What they didn't expect was to lose contact with all other members of the Akatsuki. And unfortunately for them, they were not going to be as safe as Hanzo had hoped. It was too late by the time they noticed they were being hunted down. All it took was for the leaders to split up from the group for one moment. And in an instant, 4 people were shredded apart by a series of jutsu. They had split up into groups to look for traces of the bandits, but when they realized that they had been attacked, they quickly mobilized. Yahiko called for all of them to gather in the center of the village. That was where they would make their stand, a more open field where they could at least see their enemies' attacks. Unfortunately for them, one of the people who had come back was nothing more than a transformed enemy. And when the transformed man struck, he took down another capable man that Nagato had picked. The village was immediately swarmed by dozens of shinobi, all too much for their group to handle. Shit! Hanzo has betrayed us. Nagato muttered as he looked at all of the people around them, all dressed in the Amigakure's garb. The sheer number of enemies was not something that they could have predicted. Going to the center of the village had only led to them being surrounded. and Yahiko paid the price for his bad decisions soon after. He was mortally wounded as he tried to defend the last member who had come with them with his own body. Unfortunately, after the flame dragon ripped a hole through his left side, it also hit said member straight in the chest, killing her instantly. Yahiko coughed up some blood as he fell to the ground, his left arm grasping at the charred section of his body. The stump of his missing right arm was what he ended up touching. One of his lungs had also been mostly burned off, but he was still alive, for now. It was a brutal situation. Conan panted as her paper barely kept a few of the enemies at bay. They had not sent any cannon fodder at all for that mission, it seemed. All of their enemies were either special jonin or jonin. Nagato was the only one that could effectively fight them. His use of his eye bloodline limit had gotten better, but he was still not able to use its full power. He could stop some jutsu from reaching him by pushing them away, same for projectiles and people, but his range was not that great. Things really were looking desperate for them. But when Nagato's eyes finally glimpsed at Yahiko's weakened state, he seemed to lose all sense or reasoning. He started moving on nothing but instinct, as he allowed his body to be overtaken by rage and bloodthirst. The roar he unleashed shook the very foundations of that village. The ground cracked as their few dozen assailants couldn't help but take a few steps back in shock. But the cracking dirt was not just due to Nagato's physical strength. In an instant, something was summoned behind the red-haired young man. A gigantic hand erupted from out of the earth and grasped at the ground. And what pulled itself out of the ground could only be described as the stuff of nightmares. It was the torso of a towering, earth-colored human-like entity. It appeared almost mummified. Its body was shaped similar to a robe, and it had a large number of spike-like protrusions on its back. Neither Conan nor Yahiko had seen it before. And to say they were terrified would have been putting it lightly. The gigantic monster moved almost mechanically, its mouth opening widely as it turned its eye to its summoner. Black metallic rods extended from its gaping maw, all entering Nagato's back in a gruesome fashion. The special dojutsu user grunted as he then brought his hands together in a series of hand signs. He's controlling the beast? Conan's eyes widened as she held onto Yahiko's barely breathing form. With a single wave of its hand, the humanoid beast behind Nagato raised the entire village from the ground. Houses were uprooted by the wind pressure in an instant, turning into bullets that shredded their enemies apart. Conan was forced to make a cocoon of paper as she shielded herself and her childhood friend from the powerful winds. Even if not directed at them, it was still hard to withstand. It was both terrifying and gratifying to Conan as she stood witness to it all. Yahiko's vision was already failing him though, as he was slipping in and out of consciousness. The surviving attackers didn't have the time to recover as the humanoid monster attacked again. This time it spread open its palm towards them, and spear-like protrusions started growing out of it, before being expelled outwards at breakneck speeds. The barrage lasted for a few minutes. The screams had lessened over time as the humanoid beast's projectiles pulverized all of the remaining attackers swiftly. Eventually, Conan's paper dome gave way, falling apart in a rain of blood. Bodies and body parts were strewn everywhere. There was no way to tell which organ was from where, which torso belonged to which head. They were certainly not severed cleanly, they seemed to have all been ripped apart by a ravenous animal. The sheer force of those projectiles was frightening. The blue-haired girl gulped as she still sat by Yahiko's side. Her gaze eventually reached Nagato. The red-haired shinobi looked drained, bloodied, and half-dead. His tired eyes landed on Conan, his mouth seemed to struggle to form a calming smile. But it soon died down when he heard Yahiko's weak cough. He slowly started walking towards his friends. As he did so, Conan winced as she could hear the black metallic rods behind him creak, before they finally broke off from the mouth of that beast. As soon as the rods broke off, the beast seemed to shrink back into the ground, disappearing completely into the earth. He continued to step into the various ponds of blood he had created as he finally stepped into what remained of Conan's white cocoon, turning it red as well. Nagato. Did you get him? Heh. Yahiko's gaze could barely focus to make out Nagato's face at that point. he could not make out the dozens of metallic rods sticking out of his back and spine. I sure did. Tears welled up in Nagato's eyes as he weakly grasped Yahiko's hand. Conan's hands also moved, covering both of theirs as she wept silently. Man, this sucks. I don't want to. No, there was still so much to do. Yahiko weakly coughed out some black blood as he seemed to still wish to fight against his fate. The charcoal-contaminated blood from his wounds had already made it to his heart, however. It was far too late. Not that his body could have survived long with only one lung and missing arteries anyway. The fact that he had lasted that long was already a testament to his endurance. Nagato was about to say something, to try and comfort his friend. But Yahiko didn't let him. Hey man, can you promise me? Promise me to change this world. Show them. Show them. Yahiko seemed too weak to even finish that sentence, but Nagato understood. Yes. I will show them. Rest easy, brother. Nagato's voice sounded calm and comforting. But he was the furthest thing from that. Inside he was a boiling inferno. His teeth cracked as he ground them together in rage. They had been only doing good for the land of rain, they had done so much to help everyone, showed them so much kindness. And for what? For Hanzo to just throw them to the wayside and kill them? Why? Just because he felt threatened by them again? Who was to say that the Dark Brotherhood hadn't betrayed them either? After all, Hanzo wouldn't have acted on account of Ken still being on their side. In the end, Nagato's mind couldn't help but come to the worst possible explanation for their conundrum. It was unfair. The world was unfair. Nagato knew that, but he seemed to have forgotten. Well, he was reminded once more. Even in a time of peace, the shinobi world was still committing such atrocities. If kindness can't move the world, then maybe pain has a better chance of succeeding. At that time, Conan failed to feel it, the monumental switch in Nagato's attitude. But she was sure to notice it later on. For now, though, they had survived, she was stuck carrying her two friends to safety. One for a proper burial, and the other for rest. Later that day, when Ken finally reached that god-forsaken village, he couldn't help but frown. His usual calm and refined demeanor disappeared completely, and he couldn't help but utter the following words. What the fuck just happened here? Chapter 189, Blood, Beast and Return. What the fuck happened here? The blind monster had felt it from miles away, but he was still surprised by the sheer stench when he got close enough. Ken had been through countless battlefields, his senses had been overwhelmed by the scent of blood before. What he felt around him was nothing new. But the sheer destruction around him made things a bit more tricky to understand. Then there was also that lingering aura. It seemed familiar to Ken. Familiar, yet foreign. This has to have been either the work of several S-rank jutsu, all strengthened by nature energy, which I know Nagato and the others shouldn't have access to. Or some tailed beast maybe? The damage to the surroundings, as well as the strange spikes sticking out of the ground, pointed to the latter theory. The spikes themselves were brimming with nature energy, certainly pointing to the fact that they were part of the beast's body, or at least they seemed to have come out of its body. Nature energy lingered, yet it seemed to be already dead. At least that was what Ken gathered from the spikes alone and the energy that was still around after a few hours. I can't think of any specific beast that could pull something like this off though. Maybe the Nine Tails? But that one's safely in Konoha, and Kushina at that. Ken couldn't help but rub his chin as he looked around more thoroughly, hoping to find any survivors. But if there were to be any survivors of the initial attack, they were likely long dead by the time Ken arrived. The sheer brutality of the attacks made it so that no body was even close to whole in that entire mess. It was impossible for any of them to survive. Ken could even feel the ones that had dived into the ground. They were in just as bad a shape as those that remained on the surface. The blind swordsman tried for a moment to make out the corpses. He searched through some of them, getting his hands dirty in the process as he tried to make sense of who sent them specifically. He only found a few scrolls that were still usable after being submerged in blood for so long, but they all burned up when he tried to access the contents of them. A seal that requires a specific chakra signature or tool to unlock. Ken couldn't help but scowl as he realized that the seals were likely made by a master of Fuinjutsu. Either the Uzumaki taught others as well, and spread out the art of Fuinjutsu, or they are somehow involved with the nobles that caused this to happen. The blind monster wandered around for a few minutes, all the way up until he found the now almost disintegrated blood cocoon that Conan had made. He silently stepped into it, the paper withering away as he did so. Inside his nose picked up a familiar scent. A blood he recognized. Well, the blood of two people anyway. Yahiko and Nagato. They both got injured, then? It was impossible to guess how much he had bled, but Ken knew that the two of them wouldn't die that easily. Jiraiya may have been someone that Ken joked around with, but he was a relatively powerful individual and admittedly a decent teacher as well. Nagato's weird eyes also made Ken somewhat doubt that he could die easily, or let his comrades get killed that easily. Ken tried to track the familiar scent for a few minutes, hoping to find the three of them wherever they were, but the trail went dead after a kilometer or two. Conan was skilled in her own right, and erasing traces was not that difficult at the end of the day. What a waste. Ken simply shook his head and turned around. I guess they'll just come find me in the Dark Brotherhood when they recover. I made it pretty clear that they will always have an ally with me. I also have to let Hanzo know that he didn't kill everyone and that someone else from the inside gave away this safe position. Ken highly doubted that Hanzo was involved in selling out the Akatsuki at that point. The man was near a breakdown when the blind monster interrogated him. Paranoia was already deep in his mind, and Ken doubted that he would have been able to act it out that well. But Nagato and Conan had no way of knowing what he knew. The two of them only knew that they had been betrayed. With no responses from their base, it was also safe to assume that everyone back there was dead. Hanzo sent them into an ambush, and Ken's protection either no longer existed or had failed them, making him untrustworthy in their eyes. It was easy to forget all of the help he had provided them after such a catastrophic event at the end of the day. In the end, the two of them set out to an undisclosed location, doing their best to plan for their future after burying Yahiko. Meanwhile, Ken returned to the compound instantly, sending out a message to Hanzo as he didn't care to meet him personally again, at least not for now. Upon his return to his office, he couldn't help but sigh and slowly moved to the wall to the right of his office. Among all of the papers stuck to it and all of the threads, the blind assassin slowly reached out and removed one of the posters closer to the center, where the Dark Brotherhood was mentioned. That poster had a crudely drawn image of a red cloud on it. The deep indents on the page made it so that Ken could feel it just from the wind brushing against it. In the assassin leader's hand, the page caught fire and was evaporated in an instant, leaving only ash in the palm of his hand. Ken couldn't help but heave a regretful sigh as he clutched the page silently. This deed will not go unpunished. Noble clans or not, they will learn that threatening the peace I've sought to build my whole life comes with a price. After all, whether it was red or royal blue, blood still flowed the same. And Ken was going to have to remind the nobles of that fact. But Ken was hoping to wait until the remaining Akatsuki leaders came to him or he found them before starting. Hanzo was going to be of help in finding out who exactly was behind everything. It was going to be a lot of work, and it would likely take a while, but Ken had time. For now, though, his attention switched to the wedding invitation on his desk. He shook his head, trying to get back into the right mind space to think about a wedding before he slowly ran his hand over the card. The invitation read out rather neatly. Lord Ken, it is I, Sarutobi Hiruzen, your best friend in the entire world. Ken scowled as his hands traced over that passage. But he didn't refute it. Sarutobi may have liked to joke, but he was a solid friend when push came to shove. The Hokage had also developed a level of respect for him that the blind monster didn't think would ever see in an outsider. Ken didn't quite know the exact cause of that respect, but he was not going to complain about it. With a sigh, he continued to read the letter. It is with great pleasure and excitement that we invite you and anyone you hold dear to celebrate the union of two souls, Uzumaki Kushina and Namikaze Minato. As you have always been close to the two of them, I took it upon myself to write this invitation for you, as the two of them are currently still struggling with managing other aspects of their grand wedding. Ken smiled a bit when thinking about the two children he had once saved in a forest. Now they were all grown up, and getting married. It was heartwarming, really. Minato had also proven himself to be a monster over the years. He was very close to becoming Hokage already. He had perfected a method of teleportation that had been created by the second Hokage, now aptly named the Flying Thunder God. The yellow-haired brat had now become the fastest shinobi alive by a long shot. Even Ken could not be faster than instantaneous movement, especially not in long distances. And Kushina had also developed well. She had become a Fuinjutsu master, even helping Minato become one in the process. She also mastered the adamantite sealing chains, putting her at least 10 steps above most of her peers. Ken always somewhat saw them as the cute example of a perfect couple. Some couples had also sprung up among the Brotherhood's children, but he was not one to peek into those kinds of affairs between his children. The letter still continued after that. Of course, I do mean that you can invite everyone you hold dear. I do not mind if you come with the entire Brotherhood behind you. I hope to see you here on the first day of winter. May that coat of yours shelter you from the wind. With warmth. Sarutobi Hiruzen, aka the best Hokage Ken, cringed a bit reading that last part, but he shook his head and slowly sat down on his comfortable cushy chair. I guess a wedding can be a good way to take my mind off of things for now. Chapter 190, The Leaf, Showing Off and Ceremony. Haha, can't believe we got invited to a wedding. Tatsuko, the fourth blade, slowly rested on the carriage as he looked around his surroundings. The great village of Konoha was as cheerful as he remembered it. Invited? Who the hell invited you? We're just the plus ones. Morita, the fifth blade, had somewhat become the voice of reason to Tatsuko at times. The fourth blade was strong, and he was certainly smart, but he sure liked behaving like an idiot at times. At least that was what Morita constantly complained to Ken about. The blind monster was not really all that interested in their spats. At least he was not taking them seriously in any way and just saw them as entertainment. We were all invited, clearly. You can't have more than one plus one. That's why it's called a plus one. Akira, the third blade, seemed to be of the same mind as Tatsuko. Morita wanted to refute the older blade, but he couldn't argue against his point. In a sense, the Dark Brotherhood was invited alongside Ken. The wedding itself seemed to be a grand affair, with an entire street being blocked, decorated and prepared for the ceremony and party that would follow right after. The Hokage formally invited Ken on behalf of the bride and groom, but he was not going to be providing them with anything other than his presence during the ceremony. He was also planning to help lower their alcohol supplies at the party, but other than that he was mostly there to celebrate Minato and Kushina's union. And he wasn't the only one. Plenty of merchant families were also walking into the city, bearing rather lavish gifts for the star couple of the Leaf Village. Minato, the Yellow Flash, was already considered to be the next Hokage. Sarutobi had already recruited him under his wing to show him the ropes. It was only a matter of months or years before he took over. Not everyone was privy to that information, of course, but those who had a finger on the pulse of Konoha knew enough about it to understand that Minato's standing and power made him a prime candidate for future Hokage. It was important for them to build connections to a potential Hokage. Many came even without an invitation, just visiting the Leaf Village to bring them gifts. There were also plenty who received invitations. Minato had a great reputation to his name already, and he had made a lot of connections through countless successful missions alongside his master, Jiraiya. Ha! So many people coming out of the woodwork. Tatsuko sighed as he eyed the many strangers entering the gates in lavish carriages. The Leaf Village was considered the strongest hidden village at the end of the day. A big event would always attract plenty of characters from all over the elemental nations. As the three blades present spoke and bickered amongst each other, Ken just stood to the side and scanned the village with his enhanced senses. It seems that they have upped their defenses quite a bit since last time I was here. As a Fuinjutsu master as well, the blind monster could appreciate the intricate arrays that were present within the Leaf Village to ensure its protection. The Dark Brotherhood was very much the same at the end of the day. They had trained an entire squadron of Fuinjutsu users of varying proficiency to hold and maintain the formations in their compound. Still, the raised security around the village made Ken wonder out loud for a moment. I was not expecting them to have such a big public wedding. I guess they are trying to show off their prosperity amidst the troubles brewing in our alliance. The blades quieted down as Ken spoke out. Each one of them respected their master/father at the end of the day. His words always held real weight to them. Security was a good sign of prosperity at the end of the day, and the happiness of the people, though it seemed that Konoha was not lacking in that regard either. All people in the vicinity seemed to at least be content with their situation, which was a good image. Ken proceeded to their quarters for the night, spending his time idly observing his surroundings and the people who were invited. The Uzumaki clan was also obviously present. Yorihiko had come by to salute Ken. He seemed to have left all of the work back home to Kushina's older brother, Kazue. Kazue was slowly shaping up to be the next leader of the village and the clan. The extra responsibility unfortunately meant that he was going to miss his sister's wedding ceremony. Alas, they had more than certainly spoken about that beforehand, so there wasn't going to be any drama at the wedding regarding that. One thing was for sure though. Yorihiko was not going to miss his daughter's wedding, no matter the circumstances. The ceremony quickly came along, with Ken and the Blades dressing a bit more formally, all wearing costumes and tuxedos whilst still keeping their masks on. Within a suit, Ken's muscular frame, which was usually hidden beneath his coat, was now much more accentuated. It made him stand out a lot more in the crowd. Ken's formal coat extended further than that of the Blades, distinguishing him further. The Blades were also looking quite fine. Tatsuko's suit was a bit modified due to his missing leg, but he didn't seem to be too bothered by it. They were all still carrying their blades, wrapped on their backs. Akira with his regenerating decapitation carving knife, Tasho with his blast scroll blade, and Morita with the twin lightning fangs kiba. Ken didn't carry his blade with him, but it was still on his person, hidden within a seal on his palm, drawn directly into his skin with permanent ink. Of course, the blind monster could move it around with his transformative abilities, but he decided to keep it in his hand for now. We have gathered here today to witness the union between these two souls, so that they may stay together even in the Pure Lands. The ordained monk was the one to speak out the loudest in that ceremony, his voice booming across the halls. The elemental nations had different religious beliefs when compared to Ken's past world. There was no heaven or hell, there was no specific god either. But there were the Pure Lands, the place that souls went to after death. There was limited knowledge about it. How one got there and didn't remain stuck in limbo really differed from person to person, but it was a matter of fulfillment more than anything. Unlike Ken's past world, the elemental nations had definitive proof of their afterlife existing, as there were even forbidden techniques that could directly interact with it in certain ways. But to be stuck in limbo was to be somewhere in between the living world and the afterlife. To leave the world with regrets, to live in the world unwilling, to have unfinished business, those were things that caused others to remain in limbo, or at least that was wildly believed. Many monks had created countless transcripts further looking into the concepts, and many had even tried to take a glimpse at the Pure Lands by creating strange and esoteric techniques. But the Pure Lands were not something that the living could see. However, their research led to them being able to perform certain ceremonies to lightly bind souls together. That was a wedding ceremony. To bind partners, so that they would not ever lose one another in the infinity of the Pure Lands. It was fascinating to Ken, but he was unsure that he would get the chance to experience such a thing in his life. Romance seemed like a strange concept in the first place due to his inhuman nature, but there was also the fact that the Pure Lands after death were not even a guarantee for him due to his constitution. But for Minato and Kushina? The soul binding was only natural. They were together for good or for worse, in sickness or in health, in life and death. Marriages in this world feel more serious for some reason. Ken pondered as he listened to the ceremonial rites, discovering the slight differences between those and the ones in his past world. He didn't know the full wedding ceremony in his past world, as he had only ever been present in one or two when stalking assassination targets. From the bits and pieces he had heard, they seemed similar, but still slightly different. The monk brought his palms together, seemingly sending a silent prayer somewhere as he spoke. Ken froze for a moment, as he felt a strange energy wrap around both Kushina and Minato for a moment. No one else seemed to react to it, so it was safe to assume that no one could see it. But Ken could feel it, nothing really escaped his senses. The energy lingered around the two of them, seemingly embracing them, before flowing upwards into the sky. That energy was nothing like what Ken had ever felt before. It seemed to be chakra at the base, but that small strand seemed to hold infinite energy. It was hard to understand or quantify, and even harder to describe, but Ken inherently felt that it was otherworldly. The monk seemed to be pleased with the results. As he finished praying, he looked at the couple with a smile. Today, a miracle has happened. For even here in this small world, we can make binds that last through to the vast pure lands. The union of souls is only possible when pure love is in the equation, and you have both spoken true of your love of one another. The blind assassin was unsure if that was truly the case, but if yes, then it made sense why he had never heard of any cheating ever happening in ordained marriages within the elemental nations. Of course, that was only true for those that had successfully undergone the ceremony. That way, it was simply impossible to get married in the first place if there was no love between the bride and the groom. As the blind assassin was coming to that realization, he slowly felt the guests around all stand up and start clapping, understanding the ceremony to be over and beginning to celebrate. Ken sighed internally as he felt the groom, Minato, kiss the bride, the rosy-cheeked Kushina. The two of them seemed to be on cloud nine, and how couldn't they be? Their love was now fully realized. Ken took a deep breath and slowly stood up and started clapping as well. It seems that the world always manages to surprise. That's the end of this tale for now. Thank you for watching. And I'll see you in part 9. Peace.